Our event, Transforming Education in Australia, Challenges and Opportunities. And you'll see that it is hosted by a coalition. First and foremost, the Australian Coalition for Education and Development, but also other key colleagues that are also associated with the coalition. Adult Learning Australia, and welcome very much to Jenny McCaffer, the CEO of ALA, Women in Adult and Vocational Education, WAVE, Elaine, Sally, and have we got others in the room? Welcome. Terrific. Colleagues from WAVE in the room. The Jean Monnet Network on Social and Scientific Innovation for the Sustainable Development Goals, a mouthful I know, but it's an international collaboration of colleagues that we host here at RMIT, and the organisation for which I'm directly associated, the European Union Centre of Excellence here at RMIT. Let me acknowledge importantly that we are on the land of the people of the Woiwurrung and the Bunurong language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded lands RMIT undertakes its business. We respectfully acknowledge their ancestors, past, present and emerging, but also acknowledge the traditional custodians of all the lands on which RMIT undertakes its business across Australia, and indeed in other parts of the world also. This is a very important forum from our point of view. My colleague Robbie in a minute will take you through the specific objectives and issues that we want to canvass, but the very fact that it's a coalition, the very fact that it follows in the wake of important meetings in 2022, the Transforming Education Summit, for example, the fact that it follows changes of government federally in Australia, as well as a reaffirmation of the state government we have here in Victoria, means that this is an opportune time to be rethinking the nature of education. And to be very clear, we're not talking about schools, we're not talking about universities, we're not talking about other formal institutions. We're talking about learning, education as learning, engaging all of us in a lifelong process. With that introduction, let me welcome my colleague Robbie Guevara, who many of you will know. Robbie is currently the President of the International Council of Adult Education, as just one of the many hats that he wears. Over to you, Robbie.
Thank you, Bruce. And I'd just like to acknowledge Carolyn's joined us, who was the previous convener of the Australian Coalition of Education for Development. We have apologies from the current convener, Dorothy Lacardi. She's unable to join us on a Wednesday, but she has been part of the whole process. So on behalf of the International Council for Adult Education and also the board of the Global Campaign for Education, the global platforms that I bring our experiences from Australia and my own experiences as a Filipino, having discovered adult learning, community education as an activist in the martial law times in the Philippines, and it still continues today, and I think that's part of the work we do as adult educators. We see transformation, but we also continue to see the need to transform. That needs to happen. And so I just want, it's unusual to have hybrid sessions, but I think it's something that's really important for us. So if you could just turn to the person next to you, if they might be somebody you haven't seen for a long time, and I was saying some people I realize have legs. I haven't seen them because they actually, oh, you actually have legs and you're that tall. Oh, you're that, so we're starting to see each other on campus, and it's really good. But at the same time, we need to make sure that we're inclusive, and so we have also people online to introduce themselves. So just quickly look to the person next to you and say hello, and just get to know each other. It's a networking activity. I need to look at that. see the chat. Yeah. Okay. You can leave it at that for now. Okay. So the people online wanted to see, they could hear all these buses. They say, we don't see, it's like there are all these voices. So now you can see, they can see you. So if you can just wave to them. So we'll just wave to the online people and they can wave to each other also. And so I just wanted to say that, Bruce said, oh, we can go home now. That's the energy. And I just wanted to say I wanted to make sure that people, the people beside you are alive, they're awake, okay, they're alert and they're enthusiastic. Now, some of you might have grown up, or I'm a popular educator from the Philippines, and there's this action song called Alive, Alert, Awake, Enthusiastic. Does anybody, have you heard that song? And I'm going to try to sing it in the morning. Oh, it's me. Oh, okay. Yeah. I've been and again, if any one of you are a member or thinking to be a member of the International Council for Adult Education, I did this at the Civil Society Forum in Belém in 2000 and whatever the Confintia was, the Adult Education Conference, and it goes like this: I'm alive, alert, awake, enthusiastic. I'm alive, alert, awake, enthusiastic. I'm alive, alert, awake. I'm awake, alert, alive. I'm alive, alert, awake, enthusiastic. And so, and again, for the online people, I hope, I'm a Filipino, so I love karaoke. Not necessarily that I'm good at it, but yeah. So it has this simple action. And again, I know, when I was much younger, I would go like, oh, if you want, please stand up and join me. So it goes like this. I'm alive, alert, awake, enthusiastic. I'm alive, alert, awake, enthusiastic. I'm alive, alert, awake. Awake, alert, alive. I'm alive, alert, awake, enthusiastic. Okay, so you can see the people in the room. Excellent. Okay, and so I think, why do I also start with that? Not just to wake us up, but I really think we're at a point in history where we need to be as educators, and as Bruce said, and not just teachers, not just policymakers, but everybody who's involved in learning demands that we need to be alive, alert, awake, and enthusiastic. I'd like to show a slide, and this is from a message I sent to the members of the International Council at the end of the year, just to be able to say that we need to be alive to the challenges we face and need to overcome if we are to achieve a more sustainable and equitable future for all. The multiple crises that we experience, it's just like one after the other. But I think part of that as educators is not just to say we're in crisis, but people need to understand what does that actually mean. And that's an element of learning, in that the economic crisis, the price of food, your climate and all that, how do we bring that all together without overwhelming and dispiriting and just say, I can't do anything? So how do we remain alive? We need to be alert of the role that adult learning in education. We need to be alert to the role of vocational education and lifelong learning. As part of that lifelong learning has an important role to play to address this challenge. It's not just because it's in SDG 4 that we have to do it. Before SDG 4, we were already doing it. It's just that the context continues to change. And for us, I think the people in our sector are some of the most alive to the realities that we need to be able to be alert to how we need to transform. So at this point, I think we need to be alert to the reality, awake to the reality that we cannot have business as usual education or learning. We need education and lifelong learning, not just to contribute to the transformation of policy and practice, but the policy and practice also needs to be transformed. And so we need to be transformed in order for us to be transformational and transformative ourselves. So we cannot just say, oh, I will use what used to work all the time. It might have worked before, and it might still work by all means. But we need to be alert to that reality and awake that it needs to happen. But most of all, we need to be enthusiastic, and even more important, vigilant, to advance and secure the commitments made in the Marrakesh Framework for Action. Marrakesh was where the 7th Adult Learning Conference happens. It only happens every 12 years. I've been lucky as a young adult educator. I was there at the 5th, the 6th, and at the 7th. And I know some of the people in the room, whether online, were also there in those key moments, of those global conferences. I am humbled to be in this room today with you all because you do work here. I teach at RMIT. I'm a very formalized educator. Okay, I have to do. You say, why are you awake at midnight last night? I have to do course guides. I have to do. I now have to, because I'm not getting the numbers of students. I have to advertise my course. I have to sing and dance like this to tell students, come to my class. But I ask them the difficult questions because that's what needs to happen. And they say, oh, your courses are difficult. We want a good elective that's easy. Okay, but I think so. Whereas you are all on the ground here in terms of the work. And I have been humbled to be able, again, thanks to Elaine for your willingness to share your NCVER report. I think it's a really valuable contribution to research. Thanks to WAVE, I really enjoyed, I was the only man in the room. And not that that's a problem, but the way they were doing the policy statement on the JSA, Jobs and Skills Authority, right? And being there, I was saying, oh, I'm the only man in the room, but I was just interested to hear and learned a lot around the issues that are still there. And I particularly like that, there's this notion that women have been underutilized in the workforce, and that's not true. In fact, it's more they're utilized. It's just that they're not valued in the same way. And so I'm really pleased to have WAVE as part of our coalition. And then, and thanks to Jenny again, to ALA and long-standing partners in ALA, the Stephen Billett session was, similar numbers that we have today. And this was in Griffith, right? Is it in Brisbane? And so, but one thing I like that said, there's a broader role for adult education to find what works at the local level. And so something about this, he recognized that there's something about Victoria that's unique. And I think you know what that is. There's something that the rest of the country looks at Victoria in terms of adult and community education. Not to say we should boast about it, but we should be stronger about it. And how can we actually network with others to share that experience that we have? And so I'd like to be able then, therefore, today to bring us all together in this space. In the next slide, and again, what we're not just going to talk about it. The idea is the policy forum to contribute to the current policy conversations. We are all policymakers in different sense. As advocates, as community advocates, we contribute to the policy process. Okay? It's an opportunity for us to take stock of what's happening locally and globally, but also it's an opportunity for us to engage with the interconnected themes, heightening the often missed sectors of adult learning, community education, and vocational education and training, with a clear emphasis on equity as a cross-cutting principle. And finally, hopefully it's facilitate the opportunity for civil society networks to come together and become visible as active actors in the policy space. And we hope to release a statement. It's an interim statement. You would have got a copy. And thanks again, Jenny. It's online, but also, so for the people online, I think you have the link for the people online, the link to the ALA website. If I could ask Kat to share the link, you have all the program, the draft interim statement is also there, plus the report that Elaine will speak to today. And so just quickly for today, what do we have in terms of the sequence of events? Thanks, Adrian. So there are 3 parts today. The morning session really is the policy forum where we first have, and again, thanks to the networks that people have, we have a video from the minister. We have Craig here from Victoria, and then we have Ellen Bourne, Ellen from Glasgow. I hope I have pronounced your name correctly, as the first panel. The second it will be facilitated by Bruce. I'll facilitate the second panel that looks really at Elaine beginning to speak to the report, but then have our sectors speak. So we have Jack Beatson from a First Nations perspective. We have Jenny Dodd online from TAFE. We've got ALA here, Jenny, and also Sally from WAVE to speak and respond to that. We thought, okay, that's it. Let's just do the forum. But people said some people are here and some people want to talk. So we said, okay, let's do a breakout. So for those who are available, there will be 3 breakout sessions in the afternoon. We've asked you to sign up. There will be 3 rooms available in this building, and I'll show them to you later on. Again, a breakout session, a conversation, it just needs 2 people. But the whole idea, and you could hear the buzz in the room when you just introduced yourselves. So hopefully that the breakout sessions will be a chance for you just to have more time to talk to each other. And we will have an online breakout session. It was more difficult to try to coordinate it as a hybrid session. It stops the conversation. And so the hybrid sessions are this morning, and the closing session this afternoon is where we will hear from the breakout sessions. Okay, to come together at 2 o'clock and then just report back. And so that means we start together, we end together, and hopefully that throughout the day you remain alive, alert, awake, and enthusiastic. So thank you very much, and good morning, everybody. Bruce. I've got one more slide. I'd like to thank just the rest of the people who've been helping us to organize this, from ALA, from WAVE. So you have Jenny, you've got Sally, Elaine, and Kitty. I think Kitty's joining us. And sorry, Kira, just nice to see you today. And then Dorothy from ACED, and Bruce and I. And of course, I'd like, Maren is here. Maren's been communicating with you, but then we also have, where's Ash? Ash is here. And then Kat, one of our 2 of our graduates who I've managed to recruit to community education. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Thanks very much indeed, Robbie. Thanks very much to each of you for participation so far. Can we please have the next slide? Robbie has already indicated the topic of the first plenary session, policy initiatives in jobs and skills and inclusive lifelong learning for adults. And we have 3 presenters. I'm going to introduce the 3 of them, and then we will have 3 different modes of presentation. We've got a video presentation from the minister. We've got a real person in the room, Craig, who will speak to you directly, those of you who are in the room. And we have an online contributor from Glasgow, as Robbie has said. But our first presenter, the Minister, Brendan O'Connor, Minister for Skills and Training, and has of course been in Parliament for many years. He'll be familiar to many of us as he is a Victorian. And I think what's really interesting about Brendan's statement of who he is the values and what has led him down the path that he has pursued. Next slide, please. Craig, it's terrific to have you in the room, and thanks so much for taking up the role that you have with the Skills Authority. I think somebody with your experience and background in the TAFE sector is such a key figure to have in the role. Again, you can see the words, you can see Craig's background. And finally, our third presenter, we here at RMIT, and particularly in our European Union Centre of Excellence, have a very close contact with University of Glasgow. I'm privileged to be a visiting professor there myself. We have, as part of our formal network, we have Professor Mike Osborne, but Mike has introduced us today to Professor Ellen Bohr. Ellen, it's terrific to have you stepping in to participate. And when I learned from Mike about Helen's particular background and the kind of engagement she's got in Europe, what's exciting about the opportunity to hear from Helen and to engage with her very late at night for her, and it's actually still yesterday for Ellen. Well, let's not go there. But is just that depth of experience she's got looking internationally. How do we learn from others about our place and see our place in relationship to others? And that's an important part of the process, the kind of thinking that we're wanting to engender in this first session. So thanks very much indeed to the three of you for your participation. And can we ask for the presentation, the message from the Minister, please? Thank you.
Hi everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today. My apologies for not being able to make it in person. May I acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands we're on today. For me, that is the Ngunnawal people. And for those of you in the room in Melbourne, it is the Wurundjeri people. I pay my respects to elders past and present, and do so on behalf of a government fully committed to the Uluru Statement, including the voice. One of the most rewarding parts of my work is talking to Australians who have been given a second chance through education. They may be from disadvantaged communities where they haven't been given the same opportunities as others, or they may be migrants. Equipped with new skills, so many of the people I talk to have found gainful employment and financial security. Of course, employment outcomes are important, and so is the impact on social well-being and the ability to fully participate in society. Adult and community education has played and continues to play an important role in Australia's education sector. It is a role that is understood and appreciated by many, but not by everyone. I want to see it recognised in its rightful place alongside formal schooling, vocational education and training, and university. It's important that the adult and community education sector is underpinned by a strong workforce with practitioners that have the skills they need to support learners to thrive. Our investment in Australia's highly skilled workforce will be critical to driving inclusive economic growth. A significant feature of adult learning is the importance of gender equality. As we heard from founder of the Equality Institute, Dr. Emma Fulu, at last year's Jobs and Skills Summit, women are not a problem to be solved, but rather the greatest untapped resource in Australia's economy. I could not agree more. We must give women every opportunity to take part in the labour market and to break down the gendered norms that currently exist. We must strive for a labour market where women can freely choose careers in construction or mining, and for that matter, men can choose to work in places that provide care. That's why we're engaging widely about the Australian Skills Guarantee, with targets to ensure more women benefit from government-funded projects. More broadly, our reforms to early education and care will allow families to have more affordable access to quality services that enable them to work and their children to learn. The Albanese government intends on building education and training sectors that delivers a skilled and knowledgeable workforce. Core foundation skills like literacy, numeracy, and digital literacy are crucial to ensure access to employment, education and training and lifelong learning. We have committed to a redesign of the foundation skills system in Australia. We have established a foundation skill advisory group, including Jenny McCaffer, Jack Beatson and Jenny Dodd, who are all on your agenda today. The advisory group is helping guide these reforms, bring together important perspectives from industry, unions and the education sector. This government has also commissioned a $12 million national study on adult literacy, numeracy and digital literacy to be managed by Jobs and Skills Australia. This study will provide an up-to-date assessment of the current skill levels of adults across Australia, including how best to support the skills of First Nations people. It's a busy year and we have a lot more work to do. Thank you for your hard work. You are making a difference to the lives of Australians each and every day. I hope today's discussions will help all Australians have access to quality skills and training that will set themselves up for life. Thank you and enjoy your day.
Thank you. Thanks very much indeed. Now, welcome to Craig. Craig, for those of you again who have access to the chat of the online version, you'll see that the actual full outline of Craig's CV is there. But
good on you. Thank you.
Craig, over to you.
And I do. Okay. Thanks, Roberto, and thanks, Bruce, for the invitation. It's great to be here in person, particularly to see so many luminaries, particularly around the room. In that respect, Jenny McCaffrey was here somewhere, and also Kira Clark, the president of Avetra, which in my mind, during times when research sometimes gets out the back door because of changing government priorities, it's really critical that we have an organisation such as Avetra that sort of keeps the lens on what's going on, particularly in our vocational education and training system. Now, I'm happy to be guided in terms of you telling me when to stop, because I can, as some of my staff will tell me, I can chat on a bit. What I'm wanting to do, so you give me a 5-minute signal if you don't mind. What I'm going to do is I'm going to split into two bits. I'm going to do my dutiful role as a Victorian public servant and talk to you about the Victorian Skills Authority and the like. Then I want to do some personal reflections in the second half of it, and particularly relates to the report that's been that I've got a copy of. So let's go on. And do you want me to? I just use that to click. Okay. All right. So let's just go through what's been the purpose of the Victorian Skills Authority. We were established following a review conducted by Jenny Macklin back in 2019-20. And her particular reflections were, we're not aiming and directing ourselves towards future skills that this economy is going to need. Our skills are too narrow. We've still got too many people that are missing out. And we actually need some mechanism to bring that together, because there's a whole pile of parties that have a role in really bringing skills to fruition and for people having success in their personal life. And so that's how we were established. And the marquee product, and the grey is a recent addition due to this Victorian Skills Plan, was the notion of a Victorian Skills Plan, which is really setting out a sort of a plan for action, really. And we were noticing in the office the other day that South Australia is doing a skills plan as well. So there you go. That seems to be the new black in vet, I think, is potentially what it is. I'm just going to run through this to give you a sense of a couple of things that we're doing. But the key thing around the skills plan is that firstly, we are an authority. We are not the funders, okay? So I provide advice to the Victorian government, and the Victorian government, including Minister Tini, can say, well, thanks very much for that, Craig. That's really wonderful and fantastic, but we're going in this direction, and that's fine, because it's sort of like meant to be a little bit of a hot poker to sort of stir up some action and things like that. And we well and truly accept that government, in taking into account fiscal positions, social conditions they're seeking to try to pursue, may not take all of our recommendations on board. In this case, in our Victorian Skills Plan, the government accepted all of the recommendations. But the key thing to work out how it operates within Victoria is, and this slide is now out of date because it has DET at the top, the Department of Education and Training. We've now changed departments. My apologies about that. I did that too quick in pulling this slide together. Then the Victorian Skills Authority, and then the Office of TAFE Coordination and Delivery. For those of you who've been involved in observing the TAFE world across Australia, it's been a story of amalgamations. Some have been more successful than others in some states. In Victoria, they're going with a network model and coordinated through the Office of Total Coordination and Delivery. The important things that underpin our work are integrity, collaboration and inclusion. I'll come to them later in my presentation. So we produced a skills plan last year, and essentially it's a roadmap for action, and it's in two parts. One is it really talks through what are the projected occupation demand in Victoria, and I'll go to some of that in a minute. And then it's got an action plan and what are the things that need to occur over the next 3 years, really to bring the vocational education and training system in its full concept to bear, to be an effective institutional government response to the economic and social demands in Victoria. This is to give you a sense. We also do a split across 9 regions. We've just been through the process of talking. The previous organisation called the Office of the Victorian Skills Commissioner undertook a couple of regional skills demand profiles. We're just finishing those off around those 9 classic regions in Victoria. And if we're thinking about the risk of exclusion, we know that exclusion can be experienced at a higher rate in regional centres in terms of access to services, access to education and training and the like. So I'm just skipping through this, right? I'm trying to give you a bit of perspective about how we've tried to tackle the task. But then we've given rise to these 11 actions. They are quite diverse, broad, some are quite broad, some are quite detailed, and they are to really set priorities for us to look at over the next 3 years in particular. I started off by saying that we do an annual skills plan. Well, this is really the start of the journey. It's showing a bit of a map, and we'll try to report on our progress against some of these areas that have been outlined here. And what I want to do for the purposes of this conversation primarily is to focus in on a couple of those. The one is start the vet journey at school. We know, you know in your experience, that there are now too many young Victorians, whether it's been due to COVID or it's been due to a whole range of factors, are choosing not to participate in post-school education and training, and particularly not to participate in post-school vocational education and training. And unfortunately for them, that can lead to a life of exclusion from the mainstream economy and participation in society. What has been a fabulous move in Victoria, and it was actually one of the real motivations for me taking up this role, has been the reforms that are being undertaken to senior secondary education with the introduction of the vocational major, as well as a strengthening of classic vet in schools programs, now called Vet Delivered for senior secondary students. That's actually saying for senior secondary students that you can start your vocational journey. It doesn't mean you'll end up with a classic vet prepared occupation, but you can start your vocational journey, your vocational learning journey in an integrated way as part of your senior secondary schooling. Now, let's not go back to this thing that vet in schools was for the dummies. It is certainly not heading down that way at all. It's about vocational education. It's not necessarily about training. Because what I'm really saying is we're trying to activate students in terms of vocational learning, a vocational philosophy, a vocational capability. That'll take a while to work its way through, but the vocational major is starting to be delivered here in Victoria. And indeed a sense of trying to look at what are capabilities that people need to succeed in life and in work. You will know that many employers will say through feedback, I'm getting this person coming through, but they're not ready for work. Sometimes it's unrealistic expectations, but equally they're not ready in other aspects of literacy and numeracy and the like. So we are really excited, particularly in the Victorian Skills Authority, to be able to think through, well, if this starts to happen in schooling, what can we do post-school to make that almost a seamless journey for those students? And I really wish that Jack Keating was alive, because I think he'd be really excited to see what's going on here in Victoria. Build foundation skills to enhance workforce participation. I'm preaching to the converted here. I well and truly accept this. I will often say, what good does it do if we teach people technical skills for some job when we haven't given them the foundations in literacy, numeracy, digital skills, as the Minister has indicated? We've somehow got to figure out how we're trying to do that. And as long as we continue to residualise literacy and numeracy to underneath a competency, we won't solve the problem. And I'm hoping the panel that the Minister is talking about in terms of a refresh of the foundation skills system in Australia will give us a chance to really look at that fundamentally. And the third one is to bridge the gender gap. Again, it's really fascinating that we are still a highly biased vet system in terms of gender, and it then goes on to reflect what goes on in people's outcomes into the workplace. Now, at this point, I do want to acknowledge in the room Nicole Bishop, who's at the back there. Nicole's our action officer who's looking on the gender work, but Nicole's background is in designing and analysing our student satisfaction survey here in Victoria. It's the biggest survey of all students in the vet system. It's even bigger than NCBR's one. And what is really interesting, which is part of the reason for the establishment of the VSA, was to sort of bring data insights. It's been fascinating to watch Nicole with this gender perspective to then go, well, what is some of the data telling us in terms of student feedback? So I'm leaving at middays, but I do encourage you, if you're able to connect with Nicole if you want to just talk further about that. I then want to almost turn this off, if that's okay, or can I just go back to, maybe if I just go back to this is my reflection time, right? And I want you to just have a bit of a look at this graphic here, but particularly the graphic that's for the Victorian Skills Authority, is expanding three-sided, that was four, isn't it? Three-sided diagram. And that has particular significance and meaning for us within the Victorian Skills Authority, but also the future priorities for vocational education in particular, but also tertiary education. And I think that in the inner layer, there are three perspectives or three sides to it. One is the student, second one is industry, and the third one is community. Very easy to roll that off. But why do we say student? And this is an important one that we need to be able to think through. We've actually got to bring back into our system somehow that the reason we're in this game is to bring agency to the individual, right? They're not subservient to the needs of industry, they are supporters to industry. Industry, it's not just about somebody being a cog in a productive wheel, it's really about productivity and good jobs. And if we put that lens over some of our qualifications, there'll be some of those qualifications that we wouldn't fund, and indeed that's potentially what's going to happen. And then community, we often think is about a sort of a spatial lens. What I'm really thinking about is community and connectedness and engagement. We've got a lot of our students who are now wanting to participate for engagement and for meaning and for value and contribution out of their life. And we've got to flip and think through how we do things differently in, particularly in vocational education and training. In the middle of all of that, the way I like to try to think about it is the VSA is deliberately a meeting place. It is to bring all those perspectives together and wash through those and say, in the end, what's the best sort of approach that Victoria should be taking? It's an indication that we're trying to bring all partners into the story, but fundamentally it's a story about inclusion and getting as many people as possible into mainstream participation in the economy, if that's what they're after, or self-fulfilment or actualisation, if that's what they need in their life. This is the change, the flip that needs to occur in vocational education and training. And if you start to listen to some of the narrative that's coming out, particularly from the Federal Minister, you will see this is a new perspective that's overlaying the vocational education and training system. There is still high risk, though, that we'll go back to our old ways, and I accept I've been part of that old ways. Many of you have probably been warriors on the journey about trying to say there's this different way. You need to hold on to this mission, but this is what we need to be able to do. Now, I now want to reflect a little bit on Elaine and Fran's report that I've had a chance to have a look through. And it's very sobering reading, I must confess, because indeed there are some things that are reported in that report that I know well and truly I was engaged in at that particular point in time. And to me, it seems to point to all these missed opportunities, high aspiration, missed opportunities. And one of the reflections Peter Shergold and others have had is we often have these aspirations. For us, we think about our skills plan, but we then fail on implementation and follow through. And this is a sobering read for all of us about that missed opportunity. And I think we all need to read it from that perspective. Why? And why is it particularly in vocational education and training? My personal reflections are we are always restructuring, and that's where we are now, right? Change of government, we're restructuring. Even at the state level, but particularly at the federal level, is one of our challenges. We've allowed the notion of the market to take over policy, and we've paid the price for that. The last 10 years, we've paid the price for that. That doesn't mean that markets don't have a place, similar to what the Federal Treasurer has been saying, but market isn't the objective. Market may well be a mechanism by which to achieve better outcomes, and we know that we've had problems in that particular respect. I'm close to finishing, Bruce, so okay. All right, okay. And the last thing about why it's happened is that it's almost a confused clientele. We're trying to do so many things for so many people for so many purposes, and part of our problem, I think, is we try to have a one-size-fits-all. You know, it's like the sledgehammer that's there to, bang on a gigantic bit of metal, but at the same time we use the same tool to crack open a nut, and we wonder why we end up with a bit of a disaster as a result of it. We need a high degree of sophistication when we come to our policy conversations, our educational objectives, and then our intervention design. And this is the opportunity for us to say, we're an advanced economy, we're a bit sophisticated, we can be able to do that. And one of the important things that plays out, I'll tell my staff that I'll go to the opening of an envelope, right? Because you'll see in one of the opening slides, we talked about collaboration and engagement. We learn lots when we connect and engage, and we challenge our own biases and perceptions when we can do that. And we have to deliberately, this is a strategy within the Victorian Skills Authority and the wider bureaucracy here in Victoria, but equally you'll start seeing this in the Commonwealth level as well, to be able to think about we need to connect and engage. No longer this sort of stakeholder engagement, which is sort of the episodic and sort of seen to be as a bit of a ritual, but it's got to be collaboration and engagement with meaning. Because after all, many people in this room and are online have the lived experience that we need to be able to take into account. But here's my concluding remark about this report. If essentially we have a vocational education system that seeks to mirror our economy and socio-economic profile in this country, then it is little wonder that we've done little on equity and inclusion. And by shorthand, what I'm saying is we need in the vet system to aim for the stars. We may not reach those stars, but by golly gosh, we can start getting people to think more about what they can achieve in their life. We see episodes of that, there's no doubt about that. When Jenny talks from a TAFE perspective and others, there are a ginormous number of success stories, but equally there are too many people who are left behind and are missing out on that opportunity. And we've got to get away from this sense that we are training people for the job of today with defined against competencies from yesterday. We have to think completely differently about our educational aims and objectives and our approach. And that's how we'll start to address some of the failings out of all of these reports that Elaine and Fran have done such a fabulous job in collating. And getting back to those basic principles of what are we trying to aim for? We're trying to aim for the agency and the success and inclusion of our students. And success in their life then brings success for industry in our country. And industry can be a person who has found fulfilment in their work, fulfilment in setting up an enterprise, or fulfilment in doing something for their community and to engage. We flip that. We start getting close to the SDGs, and we start getting close to being a new social contract with our students, and hopefully we bring more students along that journey. So therein lies our challenge. It's going to be tough, but I do think that both here in Victoria, and if you think about federal narrative that's going on, people are trying to say we've got to do something differently, and they're really trying to think that through. And so I've really got to thank Fran and Elaine for this report, because it does force you to sit back and say, actually, we've got to look at another way. And on that basis, I really want to thank you for holding this conference, this very important conference, and thanks for the opportunity of being here to chat with you. Thank you.
Thanks so much indeed, Craig. That's terrific, inspiring comments, and thank you so much for going into that more reflective and more personal part. That adds another whole dimension to the more formal responsibilities. Perhaps there are now many questions or comments that you have, but I'd ask you to hold them, to write them down if you're at risk of forgetting them, because we'll now hear directly from Ellen Bohr, Professor Ellen Bohr, from the University of Glasgow. Again, her detailed bio is in the chat if you've got access to that, or online. But Ellen, thanks so much for joining us. And I do acknowledge that it's still very late at night for you, but it's really terrific of you to be with us. And over to you.
Okay, can you see my slides now? Yeah?
Yep, we can.
Yeah, okay, that's brilliant. Okay, yeah, thank you very much for having me. As was already clear from the slides where people introduced the panel, I'm basically a full professor at the University of Glasgow. And you could also see from the slides that although I'm currently based in the UK and Scotland, I was actually educated in Belgium, in the Dutch-speaking part of the country, and I've done some work with UNESCO. I was, for example, one of the editors of the fourth Grail report. I've also done a secondment with the PIAC team at the OECD in Paris. But actually, the bulk of my career, I've really focused on following up on the European Commission's policies on adult education. So that's actually also for today what I really sort of want to focus on. And you'll actually recognize quite a lot of things in what has already been said during the two previous presentations, I think. Now, I actually want to start by saying that things like adult education, education and training within the European context is not really seen as a standalone issue, but it's really embedded in what we call the European Pillar of Social Rights. This was already signed quite a few years ago, but it actually means that there is sort of 20 key actions, 20 key pillars that have been designed to basically say, okay, everyone in Europe needs to have equal opportunities and access to the labor market. And within this sort of segment of social rights, the first one is actually, equal opportunity and access to education, training, and lifelong learning. I think it's actually quite important in this model that that pillar is put first, because it really sort of links in on, making sure that we can fully accomplish the other pillars as well. So chapter 2, the second sort of pie of pillars is basically about fair working conditions, such as making sure that wages are fair, making sure that there is enough sort of support for childcare, etc. But also that there is something like social protection and inclusion, good access to health, good access to sort of care, childcare, etc. That you need. So this is basically sort of setting the scene of how education and training is seen within a wider landscape of social policies within the European Union. So actually, if we sort of look into what's going on today, so I've actually been an expert member on a working group that we run for 6 years. So the current phase of that project is over now, but for the past 6 years, we've actually done reviews of all the different countries, stock taking of what has happened in relation to adult education and training across the member states of the European Union. Now, one of the initiatives that was launched, quite often actually the way the European Union works with their policy sort of reports is to do it in chunks of 5 years, or to do it in chunks of an entire decennium, etc. So actually, you could basically say that in the sort of 1960s or 1970s, there was actually really sort of humanistic focus on adult education, etc., which is very sort of UNESCO driven. But actually in the sort of around 2000, in the late 1990s, there was a sort of re-interest from the European Commission into things like lifelong learning, adult education, etc. And then in 2000, they signed the Lisbon strategy, which I will return to in a later slide. But now actually we're in this sort of cycle where the Commission has set a European skills agenda for the period 2020-2025. And as you can see, they actually have a list of 12 different actions. And these different actions actually very strongly link through things like the European Commission has signed a European Green Deal. There is something like, the sort of twin transition to action number 6 is with twin transition, we really mean like the green economy, the digital economy. As was already said in previous presentations, we need to have the foundational skills for people to sort of cope with these issues, to build further on that, etc. And actually the European Skills Agenda does not solely focus on adult education, but it also focuses on the work in relation to skills that need to happen in universities, that need to happen in vocational education and training routes that are potentially offered in mainstream schools at secondary education level. But I'm actually going to highlight a number of examples out of these actions that very specifically focus on adult learning. And these are actually actions 8, Skills for Life, action 9, the initiative on individual learning accounts, and action 10 on a European approach to micro credentials. So if you actually look into the sort of the Skills for Life approach, the Skills for Life action number 8 is basically really saying, going into this sort of foundational skills, like we really need to make sure that there's quality and inclusive adult learning, that learning does not stop when you finish your initial schooling, but it needs to be lifelong, life-wide. There need to be opportunities in both the formal and the non-formal sector. So it's actually a very broad sort of vision on what lifelong learning should be, and it can focus on all sorts of competencies, etc. So, and that is actually where what I'm going to focus on in my next slides, but I'll pay a bit more attention to two other actions. So the new agenda for adult learning is really sort of very closely linked to this action 8 within the European skills agenda. I know it can be a sort of a bit confusing, but basically you have the European skills agenda that looks into skills across the lifespan, basically for twin transition, etc. But then specifically, there's also parallel to that an agenda for adult learning, basically. But I actually want to highlight two of the core actions that we've been doing work on with this expert group on adult education that I've been part of for the past 6 years. So as in many countries across the world, and also the case in Europe, if you look into the PIAAC data, or if you look into our Eurostat data on from the adult education survey or from the labor force survey, there's no country in Europe where low educated adults participate more than than the sort of highly educated adults. So of course, one of these actions in these plans are very much sort of focused on how can we sort of help certain groups in the population to better access participation? How can we lower the barriers for them? Now, we actually know from participation research in adult education that two of the main barriers preventing people from participation is lack of time and lack of the financial resources to do this. So Europe nowadays is actually really doing well with the working group. We've done a review on micro credentials. With micro credentials, you would actually sort of take courses module by module, and these qualifications would actually be stackable. So you don't really ask people to take on lengthy, heavy courses, which are maybe not, they can't really combine that with their busy lives, etc. So you give people way more flexible routes through sort of building up a skills portfolio. That's actually sort of idea of micro credentials. But then we've also done another review, which is basically on individual learning accounts. And in an individual learning account, you're basically saying, well, what is already happening in Europe, in the different countries, on giving people, for example, an annual budget that they can spend on specific courses. Some countries have already systems in place, like, for example, training vouchers, paid educational leave, etc., which can sort of lower the financial barriers for them. So is this maybe something that can be integrated in online citizens platforms where you can actually keep track of what you're doing in terms of qualification, participation to adult education, and how many credits or how many sort of hours or how many sort of euros you can spend on these activities, and part of that would then actually be state sponsored. Another thing that we're currently doing with a course, which is another project than the experts group, is actually rolling out the number one, which is the Pact for Skills. And in the Pact for Skills, we're actually reaching out to companies, to employers, and we actually sort of want them to sign up to, as it's called, a Pact for Skills that basically shows their commitment to invest in education and training of their employees. So there's various things that we're doing here in Europe. Just want to sort of go to the new European agenda for adult learning. So there was a previous one in the previous decade. So as part of the expert network, we did a stock taking exercise, which was published in a report in 2019, where we basically sort of set out like, okay, what basically are the bonus points here, what needs to change, and whatever. Then a new European agenda for adult learning was designed. And, I just sort of took a blurb from the new European agenda for adult learning, but I underlined certain words. I mean, it's really the sort of the focus on knowledge, skills, and competencies, but also it's important to create an inclusive, sustainable, socially just, and more resilient Europe. And I mean, the resilience here is really important in the light of COVID as well, where many people have either lost their jobs or had to change plans in how they work, had to adapt to using more sort of remote digital skills, etc. So the sort of every country in the EU had to file a recovery and resilience plan to the European Commission with lots of actions, you know, on all sorts of things, but also with dedicated actions on how they're sort of going to use the skills of their citizens and how they're going to further develop the skills of their citizens to sort of cope with the aftermath of COVID, but also sort of, you know, the big buzzwords in Europe at the moment are also the transition to the digital and green economy. That's really where, you know, the prediction is there. Will the future jobs be? So you need to have people who are able to work in these sort of areas, but also you have like a number of challenges. Climate change is, of course, like a challenge that's quite often sort of, you know, mentioned, but also Europe in general tends to have like, you know, changing demographies. People are getting older. You know, there's a sort of, you know, although there's still population growth across the globe, it's not really the case in many of the European countries anymore. So you have like an increasingly aging population in many of the European countries. Now, if we look a bit deeper into the European Agenda for Adult Learning, that is actually clustered around 5 priority areas. So, I mean, the governance is a bit sort of, I think in one of the previous presentations where you talked about, well, cooperation is important. Like, one of the limitations and one of the difficulties for doing expert work, reviewing adult learning policies and governance in Europe is that the landscape is very fragmented. On the one hand, you have the, you know, you have the formal institutions, you have the public employment services, you have the ministries of education, but also the ministries of work and employment, etc. involved. So the governance needs to be efficient and effective, and there needs to be more a sort of overarching stakeholder perspective on letting people work together on designing the strategy instead of everyone just sort of you know, doing their own thing. But also, I mean, one of the things actually, if you want people to participate in lifelong learning opportunities, you also need to make sure that there's a good level of supply, because, you know, people living in remote areas or some countries that don't really invest that much of their national budgets in skills development for adults, well, it will be quite hard to get to a match between, you know, supply and demand for adult learning there. Accessibility and flexibility, something like the individual learning accounts and the micro credentials, definitely jump on that trend, make the barriers as low as possible so that people have the flexibility to learn when it suits them. But also quality inclusion, making sure that, you know, like people with disabilities, people with low skill levels who need sort of extra support there, and also green and digital transitions. I would basically say, and I'll jump to the next slide here. I'm here actually quickly going back to what I said about in the beginning about the Lisbon strategy. So when the Lisbon strategy was signed in 2000, and when we had the sort of education and training policy plan for the period 2000 till 2010, yeah, I've picked up the notice on times perfectly fine. So when we basically had that sort of 2010 policy phase, they basically said, like, look, actually, based on a 4 weeks period, 12.5% of the adult population needs to participate in at least one adult education activity, because participation in education is important to boost the economy, to maintain our competitiveness, etc. Now, in 2009, when they were designing the strategy for the 2010-2020 period, this was increased to 15%, measured on a full week's basis using data from the Eurostat Labour Force Survey. Now, one of the things in the expert group, but also in some European projects, like under the Horizon Europe framework, etc., Horizon 2020 was the previous one called. What we've basically been repeating is sort of, well, 15% for the entire population between 25 and 64. Pick out your highly educated people and they will reach that target in quite a few countries. But single out your low educated adults, low qualified adults, and they will not sort of hit that target. So can we have a bit more sort of diversified targets? So that's really here sort of participation in the sort of low qualified adults. Unemployed adults need to have learning experience, and we really need to focus on instruments like lots of European countries participate in the PIAC survey, for which a second cycle of data collection is going on. At the moment, we need to have adults with basic digital skills. I think one of the variables here that's not really mentioned that much in the headlines of the European Commission, what you have actually focused on quite a bit is the gender aspect. But in 2019, I did a project with the European Institute for Gender Equality. They have like a gender equality index, and I was basically the one who designed new indicators for tracking lifelong learning participation. Now, in Europe, you see that women actually, there isn't really a big gender difference between participation in adult education anymore. But if you start unpacking it a bit and you go deeper into certain variables, you still see that women, for example, are less likely to get employer support to participate in adult learning activities. Now, this is actually the sort of the last slide before I go to my conclusions. I just wanted to sort of give you a few examples of projects that the European Commission has implemented in the last few years. So on the right slide, you see upskilling pathways. That's what the sort of approach was called. So this was really a sort of project that was rolled out in around, I think by now, 15 European countries. So I was actually on the team for with Flemish policy people to roll that out. So it's really a sort of 3-steps approach for low qualified adults. First, we assess your skills, then we make you a tailored learning offer. And then once you've done your sort of learning, which can be formal, non-formal, or whatever, at the end, you've done your sort of learning offer. You've gone through the training that was recommended to you. There is some sort of evaluation. And if that is satisfactory, you actually get a validation and recognition of that. So it's also a bit a way of, I think there was already a question that popped up in the chat on, ways to actually credentialize and validate the skills that people sometimes have, but they haven't done them through formal learning. But also other projects have actually really sort of focused on guidance. I think I saw it somewhere in one of your previous slides as well. Sometimes people are really interested in learning or open to learn something new, but they just need some help to find access to the right sort of places for them. So lifelong guidance and sort of, doing orientation of potential adult learners to the right learning offers, as projects around that have happened as well. So this is my final slide. So rapidly changing labor markets, number of visible trends like the green and digital economy need a skilled and resilient workforce who can actively contribute to making these transitions successfully. I mean, that is actually really, I'd say, the core sort of issue and the core sort of focus point of this. Sometimes sort of European lifelong learning policies are, criticized for paying strong attention to the economic perspective. So there are actually quite a lot of sort of actions designed for low qualified, other sort of vulnerable groups. But that is really sort of to maximize their potential in the labor market, which is in itself a good thing, of course, because that can give sort of life satisfaction to people. What is a bit missing from the European perspective on all these sort of things at the moment is a bit less the sort of focus that we saw in previous centuries before I was born, let's say, on learning for the sort of civic and democratic purposes. That was the case in, for example, the 1960s of the 1970s. But there's a very sort of dominant focus on let's make sure we get people in the labor market. Let's make sure people can fulfill their potential in that way. Let's make sure that we sort of, at a societal level, at a sort of broader economic perspective, we really succeed in making the transitions that are needed. And as the previous speaker basically said, we need a resilient population, not just to cope with the skills of today, but also to make sure that they have the resilience to keep on learning and to keep on coping with the skills demands of tomorrow. So also have just a print of my book there. So this is a book I did on participation, which won the Cyril Hull Award for Outstanding Contribution to the Adult Education Literature in 2017. So if you're interested in checking out one of my co-works, there you go. Thanks a lot for having me. I'm afraid I won't be staying for the entire day because it's literally a quarter before midnight now, but I can still be around for another 20 minutes or so. That's no problem at all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ellen. I think you are entitled to go to bed at some point. So that sounds fair to me.
Thank you.
But we do have about 15 minutes or so for conversation, discussion, questions. Craig, I don't know if you'd like to perhaps come and sit out the front here, Ellen. We have you on screen still, obviously, here.
Yep.
And we have questions coming through both from audience in the room, but also in person. Mon, please.
Sorry, just one sec. You'll notice you will have microphones in front of you. If you press the talk button, you should be able to, and that way people online can hear you. Thank you.
If you push the button at the bottom,
Sorry.
yeah, there you go. You were on. Your little red light comes there.
No, it's not. Okay. You mentioned that women are less likely to participate in work and they drop off. Oh, sorry, not in work, sorry, in studies and they drop off. Can you mention the reasons why?
I think that's for Ellen, is it?
For Ellen, yes.
Yeah.
For me,
Yeah.
well, I think, yeah, the point I was actually making here is like in Europe, if you look, for example, at the data of the Labour Force Survey or the Eurostat Adult Education Survey, then if you just look at the raw participation rates, in quite a lot of the countries, there isn't really that much of a sharp gender difference anymore. But then when you start unpacking the data with some follow-up questions that have been asked, it's there actually where you start seeing the differences. So in the Adult Education Survey and in PIAC, there were questions about what were the main barriers preventing you from participation. If it's about time, there's a clear gender difference. Men basically say, I didn't participate because I was too busy with work. And women say, I didn't participate because I was too busy with family responsibilities. But also in some of the surveys, there's a follow-up question on, okay, you did participate in adult education. Who paid for your course? Did you get financial support from your employer? And there we basically still see that actually men tend to get more financial support. And that's actually sort of interestingly the case if you look into private sector, because if you look into quite a lot of women actually, as was said before, like they're in education, they're in social care, they're quite often in sort of public institutions where there might be a training offer available for them. But if it's really about the employer who sort of wants to make an investment in the training of their employees, it still seems like more money is going to the men. I mean, can have all sorts of explanations about you know, men feeling very eager to participate because they still sort of sit with the stereotype of them being the sort of main person who needs to bring in the money. Interestingly, what I actually discovered in that project with the European Institute for Gender Equality, if you look into the Scandinavian countries like Sweden, for example, policies on parental leave nowadays are very much equalized between men and women. So if as a new father you want to take quite a lot of parental leave, you can do so, but still we see from the statistics that it's mainly still the women who take up these leaves. So it's a slow cultural change as well, I think.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, Craig. Thank you so much for your reflective comments you had. I just wanted to ask you, do you think the self-assurance model of ASQA, which is now trending, would somewhere diminish the problem of what you were talking about, one size fits all attribute?
Far from it, because all that will do, well, no, so this is, I can't exactly say this. Do I need to bring it closer? Yeah. Well, you could almost say that self-assurance.
Come and join me. Come, share my podium.
Well, so look, firstly, self-assurance is a good step because it can encourage the provider to look at quality, but I don't think we're giving providers what are the aspects of quality apart from meeting every requirement of a training package. And you would have seen a press release from Brendan O'Connor last October, where, for example, he'd say in some qualifications, and in that instance, if I remember it correctly, it was commercial cookery, where there was essentially 700 functional bits of learning that a RTO had to make sure that they covered in every bit. And remember, in our current system, if one of those things fail, you're not competent. Like educationally, how have we got to that particular point? So self-assurance can work, but we've got at the other end change the qualification construct. And so we're never going to get to self-actualization of a person if we're teaching them 1 to 700 steps and say that's your fulfillment in life. We've got to completely flip the system. So yeah, self-assurance good, but the qualification system has to change in my mind. And then probably thirdly is the capability required of the provider has to grow as a result. Because at the moment, I think, and this is a gross generalisation, but nevertheless, I think it tells us a bit of a story. We have a set of qualifications that outline steps. We have a TAE that says, here are I'm going to teach you how to do those steps. And then an assurance system that says, I'm checking that you've done those steps. Now, our challenge is that we're going into a knowledge economy, and we're going to be expecting people who can be with capability and agency to work with people and systems, not just necessarily turn a bolt or whatever in a production line. You're never going to be able to remember step 65 of 700. Oh, that's what I do now. We've got to change the concept of it. And this is a complete challenge in Australia. And I think you'll find that Australia is quite unique now in its qualifications construct. When we think about the European approach, which has got a more liberal element to it, North America has still got essentially a general education approach. Now, people will say, well, that's too general, haven't got specific skills. We're big enough, ugly enough, and old enough in this world to think about doing it something different. And that's why everybody's trying to bring the educators back into that dialogue in some way. I rattled on a bit, so apologies about that.
Good. Other questions from within the room? I think we have one or two online. Can you read that, please, Ashley?
Yes, thank you. So we've had just two questions in the chat for Ellen, and she has answered them, but may want to elaborate. The first is from Kevin Hees, who asked about recognition of prior learning. It was a big in Australia vet about a decade ago, but has dropped off in more disruptive times. Are there any comments about recognition of prior learning and its importance to adult education? And then I'll just read you the second one from Leonie Wheeler, who asks about online citizenship platforms. Are there any examples of where this is working? Thank you.
Okay. Ellen, did you want to respond to those
Microphone.
questions?
Yeah, I had my mic off again. Sorry for that. Yeah, in relation to the recognition of prior learning, so Europe actually works with like a qualifications framework. So countries have actually developed national qualification frameworks. And we now have sort of overarching European qualification frameworks as well. So, I mean, it's really a bit the intention that when people basically, have certain skills, that countries come up with validation routes for those people as well. So that is actually one of the next steps in the action plan for the European skills agenda as well. So someone is making quite a lot of noise in the background. But yeah, I mean, and that was also one of the things that we actually really try to do with the upskilling pathways project, because sometimes you have people actually don't have any formal qualifications, but you sort of want
excuse
to...
me, Ellen. So, some people, could you turn your microphones off, please? If
yeah.
Yeah. So back to you, Ellen.
Yeah, so I mean, the upskilling pathways was a very nice example where there was basically an assessment of skills, and if you sort of mastered certain skills at a certain level, you were to get the qualification for it, the recognition for it. It was just if at a certain point during that initial intake they find out like, okay, you don't really master the skills for this recognition yet, that you were offered like a training pathway. So that's actually a very nice example of recognition of prior learning and etc. I would basically say in Europe, sometimes this remains a bit of a problem for migrants, for example. So at the moment, of course, Ukraine is not a member of the European Union, but of course, like Europe has been really asked, countries in Europe have been really asked to sort of show solidarity with the neighbors, etc. So, I mean, it's there a bit like how far are the qualifications that they got, for example, be translatable into the European qualifications framework. So it's there from that perspective for specific migrant population. It's a very important issue as well. I think if the other question about the online citizens platform, this is a review we've just finished for the European Commission and the expert network, and DG Employment is now actually preparing sort of plans in launching this more across Europe. But I know in Belgium, I'm basically Belgian national and a British citizen as well, but I grew up in Belgium. There's a website called It's Me ID, and you basically have your identity cards. You have like a reader that you get from the government. You plug it in, and everything that relates to you as a person is actually there. So one of the recommendations that we made is actually that all your sort of qualifications, if there is going to be something like an updated system of individual learning accounts, that it's all centralized in that platform. So someone in Belgium would just have to click in their ID cards, they click on the education button, all their sort of degrees and certificates are there, and they say, oh, for this year, you still have an allowance of participation in an adult learning course for, let's say, 100 hours or whatever, and you can sort of track it online there. So we're working on that at the moment. So it's really cool stuff happening there. Yeah.
Perhaps, thank you very much, Ellen. Concluding comments from Craig. We're just about out of time.
No.
So wrap us all up.
I'll just talk about RPL. RPL is still a strong tool, particularly for those people who've learnt informally or worked on the job and have that recognition. Unfortunately, its execution is quite a challenge now, because you'll find most feedback from both practitioners and from participants is it's probably easier to do the unit. And this is a reflection again that we've specified so much within the units that it sort of takes away from the intent of what recognition of prior learning was to accept and realise the strengths of the individual and how that can be recognised. So that's a challenge we've got. Then I always find a bit curious that we then go to RPL for transitioning workforces. And so we're going to RPL them in a occupation that's declining. And so maybe we need to think about, are we doing a skills reflection that recognises the transferability of those elements that they've got? Because at the moment, if it's bundled under a certain qualification with this competency, it's aligned almost to an industry. That doesn't help with mobility and recognition. So I think there's the next challenge for us in Victoria and Australia as we're going to adjust for clean economy outcomes. Thanks, Bruce.
Thank you, Craig. I am conscious of time because we're on a fairly tight schedule. We've got 15 minutes now break for morning tea. But can I just say thanks so much indeed to the Minister in the first place for taking the time to share with us that video presentation, but particularly Craig and to Ellen for their time, both their presentations and their engagement in the conversation. It's already highlighted, our conversation already has highlighted critical themes in terms of the current availability of the formal institutions of education and training, also pointed to the importance of the non-formal and the broader lifelong, life-wide dimensions. But as well, it's highlighted some of the critical questions in terms of us as people. Who gets access? Who is able to benefit? What kinds of relationships are fostered through the current arrangements, and how do they engage with the challenges that we face at the present time? Words already have been used, like crisis, like transition. The Guardian the other day referred to a polycrisis, and you know, jargon can abound in a time like this, but that we have serious issues with which to engage is clearly paramount at the present time. So can I again thank our presenters, thank our contributors in the discussion. 15 minutes break, and then we'll move to another level of exploring the detail that Elaine and her colleagues have produced in that report, and then some commentary on those issues. Thanks very much indeed. And for those of us in the room, of course, morning tea is outside, and for those of you at home, please go and find the kettle in your kitchens.
Can I just check the Jack Beatson? I can see a Jack. Jack, is that you?
Yeah, that's me. Yeah.
Hi, Jack. Can you have a video?
Yep.
Nice to see you. It's been a long decades.
Yeah.
I still had hair then.
Yeah, me too.
Thanks, Jack. Elaine. Yeah, so I don't know. What hashtag do we use? I don't know.
I don't know.
do you know?
Social media and
I don't do that. I don't have any.
We can
create one?
We can do Adult Learning Australia. Oh, you want to create one?
Well, sometimes we
you
just
have one with hashtag.
Yeah, we can do that. Adult Ed.
adult ed and just encourage people to Twitter or whatever.
Do you have?
Yeah, I was looking for you.
I'm not on Twitter.
No, I couldn't find you. I was
No,
going to
you
tag
can't find
But you
me.
can hashtag on LinkedIn as well.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, you can.
So this is the clicker.
Okay.
It's just forwards arrow to go forwards, backwards arrow to go backwards.
Sorry, forwards.
So forwards arrow. So
Okay.
in the direction that you read.
Right.
And then this one is to go backwards.
All right.
And this is a laser pointer if you want to.
Oh no, I don't.
Point
Sorry.
at someone's eyeball.
All right. And I won't be going backwards, so I just have to do this one.
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Beautiful.
Thanks.
What was your name, sorry?
Elaine.
You're Elaine. Okay.
Yeah.
Eden. Lovely
Nice
to meet
to meet
you. I'm going to the bathroom as well.
Yeah.
Sarah. Tried them yesterday and
And you'll have control?
Yeah,
Okay.
I was going to sit down and do it, but I was just thinking I probably should stand up.
Well, whatever is easier for you. The microphones will work either. If yeah.
I received just I will share to Bruce also. There is a session today at UNESCO, Knowledge Learning. Maybe it could be interesting, but no one can participate because it's in the afternoon. Maybe you can. No, it's the afternoon in Europe. I don't know what that is.
That's already past midnight.
Anyway, they are.
Yep.
This is. It's today. It's a European.
Yeah, but so tonight.
Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hassles people.
Yep, that's right. So as people are settling in the room, and thank you for being disciplined and bringing your kappa in. So as Bruce said, we've really had an excellent opening, and so thank you, Craig, still here with us, and we acknowledge therefore that Ellen has to go to sleep. And as I was telling Ellen, sometimes it's nice to see, because I usually start my meetings at midnight also with the International Council. It's nice that it's reversed at the moment. But I'd like you to welcome to the second of the panel. So the first gave us a really good overview of the policy frameworks, but also the policy challenges. This time, I think, and thanks also to Craig for really acknowledging and responding to the report that we would like to. And as I said, very few people have seen the report yet, and so you're one. It's not officially a launch, but we were thinking that it would be in the NCVR website, but it's not yet there. It's almost going to get there. So you have a copy. You have the link, and the link is in the Adult Learning Australia website. The full report is there. For those who are online, I think Kat's put up the link. So the link is there. The program is also there, and then the draft forum statement that we hope to release today is also there. And we promise that the recording is happening, and we will be able to put the recording and the presentations also there. So thanks, Jenny, for making that accessible, available for people. And so this panel really now is that conversation of what does it mean hitting the road in terms of the policy framework, but also then perspectives from the different sectors. And so I'd like to welcome Elaine. And as you can see, Elaine is very quiet about some of her achievements. But when I said, Elaine, I know you were the member of the Order of Australia in 2021, when people were all in the midst of lockdown, she said that's good, it's quiet. But I really think that people sometimes it's us in this work who are quiet about what we do, which I think it's nice, because that's the nature of who we are. But that means we become really invisible to the people. So what do you do? But so I think I'd like to acknowledge that, Elaine, and for others, and again for others in the room, and the next person, Jack Beatson, Professor Jack Beatson. I met Jack and I decades ago, and I'd like to again acknowledge in terms of how Jack, the work that Jack has been doing. We crossed paths, Jack, at the ASBE, the Network of Adult Education in the region, in the Asia Pacific. And if the slide can be moved, and again, I'm again a colleague in that you are one of the first members of the Continuing Adult Education Hall of Fame, to be first Indigenous Australian to be inducted in the Adult Hall of Fame. And so I'd like to acknowledge that. And again, I think this is the testament to the kind of work and the kind of people we have on the panel. So Jack is, I might pronounce this wrong, Ngamba man from Western New South Wales, and involved in Indigenous education, Indigenous literacy, and Executive Director of the Literacy for Life Foundation. Welcome, Jack. And then I'd like to welcome Jenny. There are two Jennys on the panel. Jenny Dodd. Can I have, so Jenny is the Chief Executive of TAFE Directors Australia, and since August 2021. TDA members consist of all Australian TAFE and dual sector universities with vocational education and training division. So I guess RMIT is a member of that. I'm not directly involved in the TAFE sector or the vet sector at RMIT. I teach in a master's in international development, but our school used to have both the higher ed and the TAFE together, and now there's a dedicated TAFE college at RMIT. But I'd like to welcome Jenny for again joining us today. To complete the panel, two friends, colleagues, and co-advocates who are here with me. Sally Thompson, okay, is with WAVE in education policy research, advocacy, project management, currently in the government. But we crossed paths ages ago, and Sally was with Adult Learning Australia, and we did some wonderful stuff together, some writing together, and so it's good to reconnect with Sally in WAVE. And of course, Jenny McCaffer from Adult Learning Australia. Some people say I don't sleep. I think Jenny doesn't just sleep, she doubles up the time. And I said, by the time I wake up, there's so many emails from Jenny, and she's done this, that. But I really acknowledge the work, and it's really good to know that the voice of the adult education community is being heard. And again, as the minister has said, that I think you, Jenny, and Jack are in that advisory committee, and it's affirming, I guess, for us to be able to know that we are in good hands. But at the same time, I think you should be able to feel that you have the support of the community, and so it's in this spirit that we open this conversation. And I'd like to welcome Elaine again to share with us the report. It's the first, it might be the first time you're speaking to it publicly, and so we really are privileged to be able to hear this from your voice and your experience. And so Elaine prefers to sit down, so can we check that the microphone is working?
One of the being short. Ah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
You got that?
Yes.
And
Thank
I'll
you.
give you a sign, 5 minutes as well.
Yes.
Okay.
Good morning, friends and colleagues. Before I start, I'd just like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people, the traditional of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional custodians of this land. And I pay my respects to the elders, both past and present, and extend that respect to any other Indigenous Australians who are present here with us today, here in the room or virtually. I also acknowledge the traditional owners of our lands and waters, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, who I think are the first educators and the first teachers of this land. We owe them an enormous debt, and their access to knowledges that we have yet to understand is a huge gap. I support the Uluru Statement of the Heart, Truth, Treaty and Reconciliation, and the intent of the voice. And I think this is another big learning journey that Australia is about to set out on. I'd also like to thank RMIT and the EU Centre here for hosting us and making this event possible. So, a starting point. Robbie mentioned being alive, alert, awake and enthusiastic. At this particular stage, yes, I hope that I'm all of those things. But I'm also going to break every rule of being an adult educator. I have far too many slides. You're going to get the copy, able to get the copy eventually with a bibliography on the end. And so I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour through not just the report, but also some of the events that are coming together at this particular time that I believe we need to take into consideration, given the very broad title of what I've got to talk about. My flipper's not working. Slide flipper. Ah, there we go. Thank you. So where I'm starting at is that I think at this particular moment in time, we're in one of those absolutely pivotal moments where how we go to seek out information, how we listen and learn and think, and more importantly, act around our collective and our individual choices has the potential to really shape our shared global and local futures. And while it might be a moment of risk, I think it's also a moment of great opportunity. So I am certainly feeling hopeful, optimistic, and enthusiastic. And I'm going to launch straight into some of the stuff that's happening on the global scene so we can locate ourselves not just in what's happening here, but also in what's happening elsewhere. Now, this is going to be some quotes from some rather strange bedfellows, but they are also global movers and shakers. And when we start to speak the same language, this is where I think synergies become malleable and workable and open up gaps. So this was a comment at by the World Economic Forum president last year, renewing and improving the architecture of our national and international political and economic systems is this generation's defining task. This is post-COVID. It will be a monumental undertaking, but it's an indispensable one. And if we don't address this, a report in 21 and certainly 22 shows us how high the stakes are. So as far as I'm concerned, we're at an absolutely significant moment in time globally and also here in Australia. But we're at this moment of, as I said, of amazing opportunity where we have a unique advantage to learn not only from the hard lessons of the past, but to vision the kind of futures that we really want. Transformation is now a buzzword, it's everywhere. that can be a good thing, but it's also something that I think that we have to watch. And we have to not go back, as Craig mentioned, to building back, but what we need to do is to critique and move forward. So we're not building back, but we're transforming forward. So, and this is going to take into account our institutions, our social contracts, and our practices. And it's my firm belief, and always has been, that equity, inclusivity, and participation, along with sustainability, are absolutely central to this. So getting back to the World Economic Forum, they've been doing some very useful analyses that put the driving forces in slightly different categories. And this, again, I think is useful. Megatrends, and these are the things that shift paradigms. The trends, gradual and long-term shift in forces that are shaping nations, regions, industry and society. I think it gives us a different frame to start to think about the things that are pushing us. Weak signals, they say, the first symptoms of change that might become significant in the future. And sometimes it's difficult to see now, but they can have a very big impact later on. The wild cards, the things that come out of left field, and I think we know, sometimes we think they're going to have low probability, but they'll have high impact and unexpected outcomes. And the uncertainties, which is a critical driving point that could lead to alternative and contrasting evolutions and implications of long-term impact. So what we've got here is a set of converging interests and different worldviews that I think we can share and we can work under in this world of relative. We're going from predictability into a world that's a whole lot more fragile. And these things also, particularly for VET, show us just how uncertain our futures are. And I hark back to what we're saying about how our qualifications are set up. That in industry, nearly 40% of global CEOs don't think their companies will be economically viable a decade from now, and if they go down their current path. And also 75% of organisations aren't prepared for the pace of change that's about to hit them. So as educators, where we're projecting forward about what people need to know, this really pushes us along. So we're not only it's a big wake-up call. It's not only about the future, but it helps us to decide what we should and can do right here and now. And then, of course, there's all the other things that are in our interests all the time. And I'll just go back one. I didn't think I'd be needing to do that. From people like the OECD, the way that they're looking at climate and health, and also the whole new geographies of work. So these are really interesting little graphics that have been picked up through some of the global meetings that are picking up on the conversations about the people that are talking about its sustainability and. So what the World Economic Forum is saying is that we actually need different ways of even thinking about how we're going to move forward. And they've come up with these three categories that are interlocking: future thinking, so we have to be able to embrace uncertainty and explore and think about different ways. Systems thinking, which we had a bit of discussion about yesterday, which is a little bit different from design thinking, but to be able to explore the bigger picture and then work out how we're going to locate in that and the outcomes, but also exponential thinking, the ability to fully comprehend that something very marginal and small today could become something very prominent tomorrow. This is what's coming out of our common agenda, which I think is a very useful framework, and I'll just spend a very few moments talking about this. It's following on from the SDGs, Confintia, and also the Transforming Education Summit that Robbie mentioned, and I'll checked on briefly. Education is everywhere in this, and the common theme is that education is in crisis. The common agenda, also their diagram, which is in their report, and I'll have all the references at the end of this presentation, has actually got a pathway forward out of the moving on from the SDGs, and it's you can see on this bottom line here where the Transforming Education Summit is moving us now to happening this year, the Summit of the Future, and then future again, the World Social Summit, where world leaders and hopefully CSOs and a whole lot of other people are coming together to get some consensus about where we go on this. So they've got high-level tracks set up, all underpinned by education. And I think rather than, I'll let you have a look at this, but you can see, yes, it's very ambitious. Yes, it's sustainable, but it's got education there as a bottom line plank. Going along with the our common agenda is the call for renewed social contracts globally and nationally. And the words here talk back to us about education again. Education and skills development, formal recognition of the universal entitlement to lifelong learning and reskilling that's translated into practice through legislation, policy, and effective lifelong learning systems, and decent work that's linked to that. And there's a diagram that I've tipped sideways for this that shows that what they think this renewed social contract globally, and I think we're moving towards here in Australia, looks like, where it puts the individual, the private sector, state institutions and civil society within these different these different ambits of trust and moving things along. I'll let you research that. So 2 minutes about 1 minute about the Transforming Education Summit that demonstrated globally the commitment to the fact that education is in crisis globally, and the summit actually provided this absolutely unique opportunity to put education, and this includes training, right at the top of the global agenda, political and social, to mobilise action. So we're going to be seeing a lot of things happening very quickly. It's very difficult, I think, to keep up with it. So what it says is that there's an urgent political imperative for our collective futures, that we transform education, and that education systems globally are no longer fit for purpose. And this, I think, is our basic challenge, and it's also our big opportunity. Australia attended that particular summit, and this was the statement that they put out. And for the first time that I can remember, they actually acknowledged SDG 4. This has always in the recent past been something that belonged to DFAT. So the fact that this is getting integrated in, and there's this call that that one thing that worries me a little bit, and I've taken the liberty of putting this into italics, is they're talking about promoting lifelong learning rather than actually formalising it. So I think that's a bit of a slip. I just wanted to make something clear, and that too about the way I talk about education, and about a way that a lot of the discourses that we hear talk about education. We've held ourselves in a position of pride globally, thinking that we're doing really, really well, even though there's been kind of a lot of critiques coming now for quite a long time. And it's, I think, pretty well recognised that our systems here aren't fit for purpose. They're not equitable, and they're in need of urgent reform, not tweaking with all the bits that we've grown so familiar with, which is another concern. And it's well over time that we tackle what we're now seeing started.
Elaine, 5 minutes.
Wow. Okay. So I'll skip all the rest of that and just leave you to follow through on the slides. Very quickly, I say why I think VET is a focal point for this, and how the parameters are set in the definitions of VET, the dual responsibilities, the power of the Productivity Commission has had here. And then I move to looking at equity, inclusion and diversity, saying that skills count. So the other thing I wanted to mention is that Australia is also in the process of now building a national, it's going to be launched later this year. First time is a national strategy for gender equality, to achieve gender equality. And the other thing that I wanted to point out is that underneath the National Skills Agreement that's going on, there's actually a statement of visions and principles that a lot of people don't know about, that actually commits to not only to TAFE, but to equality, diversity and inclusivity. So I think it's up to all of us to keep an eye on that. Okay, to move on to the report, which I'll do a very quick wrap up. Fran and I actually ended up calling this it. I'd like to pay my respects to the VOCED database for actually having the foresight to set up what they're calling their knowledge series, and also for them actually agreeing to put online this enormous document. They have said that when they asked us to look at equity in the system, they really didn't understand what they were asking of us. We changed it from equity and access. The main report isn't on the ALA website yet. It's over 200 pages. And what we've done is collected all of the policy, all of the statements, the critiques, which we had to go through, the national strategies, but looked at the climate in which they were actually brought about. We set it in 3 periods of economic change to try and make sense of the political situations, and so the compromises and the negotiations and the disappointments that happened all the way through there. This gives an overview of the big report. The one that you have access to is linked back to the very big one, so I encourage you to dive into it. And NCVR are frantically building the site for this. They hope it'll be up fairly soon. We wanted to do this, even though it ended up being a huge labour of love, unpaid as most things are. So there's a collection and a repository of so many things that have just disappeared out of the public domain, and the documents will now be there for people to get, which has been part of the report. So we talk about equity and what it actually means, that education is a human right, and so is VET, which we don't really know about. And then we looked at all the name games Craig referred to briefly this morning, all the churning that's gone on about VET, how we've gone from being technical education right through to missing the education in it at all. And we're pretty much now talking about jobs and skills. The other thing that we mentioned here, and I wanted to bring up, is that where does VET belong? Does it belong in education? Does it belong in science and technology? Does it belong in employment? Does it belong in workplace relations? It doesn't sit anywhere, but it's across all of the sectors of the institution of education. And so with reforms that are going on in education, if we're not involved in those as much as we are in what feels like very rapid and almost piecemeal consultations that are keeping us working night and day at the moment, we're going to miss out on a lot. So I'll just skip now right to the end. The slides, I should say the document is not an analysis, but it's a collection with some of our thoughts. And because it's so recent, it's now sitting there. It's ripe for people to use it as a research base for an analysis to inform policy work. I started to actually pick up on some of the main points. So the definition and the location are a problem. The actual foundations and the assumptions that are underlying our system at the moment need challenging. It's still built on pre-colonial, its basis is what I would say racist, and it's certainly sexist. And the way that stakeholders have been engaged with, it makes a very interesting track through to see those assumptions that are never challenged. Craig brought some of them up this morning, that we're there to serve industry and it's time to flip the system. along with the other people in schools who are saying, flip the system failure, and the universities that are going to be having a total new accord, somehow or other, a whole root and branch review has to happen for VET. The Kangan era established a basis for a fair go with a proactive agenda of outreach and inclusion. The focus on women in TAFE, in fact, led to the first national plan, and that in turn shaped the first national equity strategy, which was the National Women's Vocational Strategy way back in '96. We weren't able in the report to follow all of the ones. The history of each of those probably needs pulling out for our First Nations peoples, what's happened around disability, and the ever-changing so-called target groups and cohorts that end up making up 75% of our population. And so we get the question, who is the system actually serving?
1 minute, Elaine.
It's excluded educators, and we think a critical opportunity was missed in Anta's purview of first get the system right and then do equity. So equity has been an add-on ever since then. The shining light, as far as we were concerned, was the work that was done for NVIAC, and is still today presents a really good model of what the system actually could be doing, its definitions of equity, how it consulted, how it built on the past. It was closed down. It had a very brief lifespan, but was closed down again at a change of government. But we would urge people to go back and look at that particular work. So moving right through to the future, what have we learned? Okay, I won't zap through. That equity always has been and remains a problematic concept in VET. That policy change has been messy, unpredictable, evolutionary, with governance and frameworks and provision linked with economics, economies, politics and value systems and ideologies of its time. While notions of fairness alongside racialised, gendered and class-based discourses can be traced back to the beginning, the positioning still remains nebulous. Our history and archives that we have through the VocEd database, etc., are an invaluable source of knowledge, both as success, but especially of the failures and why they were negated, and that research and sharing, knowledge sharing networks and sustained evidence-based advocacy and activism are critical components for our system right now. So where to next in the name? I've said that with the Australian government's vision that appears to be unfolding through a suite of interrelated cross-portfolio change agendas. For those of us with an interest in capital E education, again, this is our moment. The reforms are unfolding through a whole lot of different mechanisms, which doesn't augur well for a comprehensive review and transformation of the institution into a more integrated whole, rather than focus on change specific in those different sectors. That the government, I think, has got a difficult and time-consuming work ahead of it, and it's going to be hotly contested by regimes of power that ultimately require, but these regimes of power themselves ultimately require a rebalancing. So despite the uncertain futures that confront us, I think, as I said at the beginning, this current epoch of significant change presents opportunities, not only for a new global social contract, but a new social contract for education, and we've got a new government. So it may be that this is the moment for transforming education and training in Australia into an integrated institution around a concept of lifelong learning, including VET and a system that has equity at its centre, that it's inclusive, equitable, and sustainable VET and school system for the benefit of all Australians. So my final slide would have been, don't keep calm, go and change the world.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry to do that, Elaine. So we now know there's lots that we need to be able to discuss, but it's good, to be able to frame it and open up. And I think part of the challenge is, as you said, you can't really jump into the analysis without the context of understanding what's happening globally and then coming into that place. And so to give us the contextual, the contextual response, I'd like to welcome Jack Peterson to be able to respond from a First Nations perspective. Thank you, Jack. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you, Roberto, and thank you, Elaine, for all that you've said there and highlighted. I certainly agree with a lot of that. I want to acknowledge the Parramatta people of the Eora Nation in Sydney, near Parramatta, and also I want to acknowledge my own people, the Nyimba people of the far northwest of New South Wales, in a town called Brewarrina. I'll hop right into it and just go through some of the stuff on the slides, and if we can go to the first slide. We're an Aboriginal-run charity, I guess, teaching Aboriginal adults to read and write. We run an innovative program that originated in Cuba in 1961, and it's helped 10 million people in developing countries around the world and adapted for use here in Australia with Aboriginal people. And when we adapt it, we quite often adapt the language to a language of familiarity in whichever community we're in as a starting point for the model. More than 40% of Aboriginal adults have low literacy, low English literacy, as high as 70% in remote communities. Now, that's a very conservative estimate that we're talking about there. In some communities, remote communities, it could be as high as 90% or more. In communities in New South Wales, it can be 65 or 70%. So this is not something that's out there in the middle of the desert where nobody ever goes. This is happening in reasonably urban type towns or regional towns and cities that we're working in. If we could just move to the next slide. That just gives you some of the ideas, or gives you an idea of some of the places that we're working in. And if you look at those places, some of them are quite famous for being dysfunctional for all the wrong reasons. And we've been given an allocation of funding from a variety of sources. It's a smorgasbord of sources that we've got our funding from. And we heard, Elaine talking about, where does it fit? Where do things sit? The Literacy for Life Foundation is homeless. It's absolutely homeless because nobody will take ownership of this within government. And that's where we sit today, and it's part of our struggle. And when we talk about policy reform and fixing policy to support people, the Literacy for Life Foundation, its only home is in a policy vacuum. That's where we live, because it's that policy vacuum that basically wipes us out of accessing funding for these programs. And so informal education such as ours, which is where you have to start when some of your community literally only know 4 or 5 letters of the alphabet when they start in this campaign. So you can't start at level 1, where the Australian Core Skills Framework begins, in which everything is measured and funded by. We have to start before that. And if I'm sounding frustrated by this, I really am, because that's where we live at the moment. Can we go to the next slide, please? These are some of the results, and we've annually evaluated over 335 graduates so far. We graduate people at more than 4 times the rate of comparative programs. Over 50% of the Literacy for Life graduates move on to work or further study or volunteer roles, which are active citizens, I guess, is what this allows people to do. It's not feasible to expect everybody in these communities to be able to find a job. But what they can do is they can actively participate in those service organisations and community organisations that are actually impacting and affecting their lives. That's probably in many cases more important than having a paid job for some people. Students improve on one Australian Core Skills Framework level on 1 or more indicators within 6 months. 50 odd or 50 plus Indigenous jobs have been created within the campaign so far, with locals teaching locals. How this model works is that we train local Aboriginal people that can read and write, regardless of how remote that community is, to facilitate lessons with their own people in their own way. And so this is, for me, if people often say, why does this model work? It works because of that. It works because the community do the work and the community own the campaign. So could we just move on to the next slide? So here's the Indigenous student completion rates, as you can see there. Clearly, the national VET cert rate is 32.8%. Ours is 60.2%. Can we, again, just move on? This is why it works, is that the community own the campaign, and that's the first thing that we do, is we go into a community, we train local people to do a household survey. We don't do any of that, we just do the training. The community go out and do that survey. They're talking to their own families, their own mobs, so people are fairly candid in their response, probably get a more accurate view. And one of the things that we ask the community is, do you think this is a good idea for your community? Do you think this is something the community could use? Our feedback on that one question alone has been, in every community that we went into, is you're the first people that actually come along and ask us if we wanted something. Most people come into communities peddling snake oil as programs that they're going to bring to the community. This is it, this is what we've got for you. The other thing that makes it work is the campaign approach. It's not about a course, it's not about enrolling and finding your way in, it's about getting everybody in the community aware of it, and that's part of the survey, get everybody aware that there's a campaign, and we engage then people to encourage people to continue to come along at that foundational level, because it's very difficult. There's a whole range of issues, and I don't have to go into those here, that prevent people from coming along. One of those, and probably the most important one, is shame. But when the whole community is supporting you and encouraging you to come and learn to read and write, that certainly moves a bit of that on. There's a couple of photos here.
3 minutes, Jack.
How many?
3.
3, well, okay. So there's just a few photos there. You might want to show them. But anyway, you know, if you just put them up and roll through them as I'm talking, there's a couple of things that I do want to say. Elaine mentioned, you know, that education globally is in crisis. If you've got communities that I belong to, that even if it was only 40% low literacy or 70% low literacy, that means that several households in our communities don't have a person that can read and write living in that household. That's what it means. So it's not in crisis. In Indigenous Australia, adult education, adult literacy is in the absolute disaster space, because we haven't got people in there. We have people living in those homes that can't read and write, that are administering medications and so on, not just to themselves, but to parents, to their children and grandchildren and babies. That in itself should send alarm bells off into the community. That's a situation that needs to be fixed. But how long have we been making recommendations to government? This foundation itself has been recommended by a recent Senate inquiry into adult literacy to be funded by March this year. Again, that won't be listened to, and that's not our recommendation. That's a recommendation from them to, you know, to the government to do that. I just want to talk about something here, and this, I guess, is the frustrating part, because as you all know, we've been providing advice. I'm on 2 advisory committees right now in Australia, advising on foundational skills and adult literacy and so on. And in the papers that were provided to everybody here today, one of the things that jumped out at me were recommendations that were made by Tiger Barnes. Tiger Barnes has now passed away. He's not the first person that has passed away over the last 200 years, that passed away not knowing what has happened to those recommendations that were made by him and his team, whether they'll ever be introduced and taken notice of. So my question to the government and to people here is, how many Aboriginal people are going to die wondering what has happened to all this advice we've given, wondering whether someone is actually going to take us up on it. Wondering from that inquiry, when we let the Aboriginal people from Tennant Creek come onto that inquiry with us to present to the inquiry, what is going to happen to their advice? This is the critical thing for Aboriginal people. I'm not overreacting because I'm one of those people that may very well not be around to know what happens to some of the advice that I've given. You know, what happens from this forum. But when I seen that thing from Tiger Bales, it was a timely reminder that so many Aboriginal people have continued and constantly provided advice and been asked for advice on the same or similar questions for the last 200 years, and we're still in this same situation that we are now. So my answer is that these programs that are run and owned by local Aboriginal communities, they're the programs that should be funded. They're the programs that need resourcing. We have 100 communities that have asked us to come into their community with this campaign model because they've heard how good it worked everywhere else. We are currently funded for 6. That's a crisis, if you ask me. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jack. Yes, I clearly remember, and I think the distinct difference of the campaign approach and the talk about informal education, and you still have that, and I'd like to acknowledge that. And I'd like to welcome Jenny Dodd to be able now to respond from TAFE Directors Australia. Welcome, Jenny. Yeah, again, 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me as part of this discussion. I'm coming to you from Ngunnawal country, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present and recognise all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are part of this conversation today. And thank you, Jack. Every time I hear you speak, it reminds me how absolutely critical it is, the partnerships that TAFE can help play, if we can, in so many important programs that embrace opportunity, equity, and the ability for people to learn and have control over their own lives. So thank you, Jack, for that. Thank you to Jenny McCaffer for inviting me to be part of today, and to Elaine and to the previous speakers, because I think there's been some really thought-provoking comments made in the way in which this conversation is evolving. When Jenny asked me, Jenny said, this is a policy forum. So I'm going to make a few statements around what I think are some of the policies going forward. And I think a lot of us are well equipped with knowing some of where we land in the space of vocational education and training and community education in that relationship. But I think we are at a moment in time. Elaine said we need to be urgent reform, not tweaking. And I think there are some conditions that we sit within at the moment that we need to grasp. And some of that comes to some of the work that Jack was talking about too, where Jack said they had no place. There is no place for where they sit. So a couple of key comments, firstly, from a TAFE perspective. First off, we can't acknowledge more strongly the work of this government in changing the perception of TAFE and the acknowledgement of TAFE as heart of the system. We're public providers, as you all know, and public money really needs to be going in many ways into where equity and inclusion occurs, and that's through public provision. It does not need to be going necessarily in the way in which it has been over the last 20 years into a marketised RTO structure that sees nearly 4,000 RTOs, of which about half of those are designed for profit making. And the worst instance we saw about some of that occurred through the vet fee help debacle that went on some time ago. At that, I think it's really important, therefore, that this is a conversation we do need now. And in some public forums, I've been publicly saying we probably have too many players in the system. And are we therefore creating around that a system that perpetuates a system rather than being able to really look at where we need to be putting the funding? So I think we sit at a rare moment in time. And that rare moment in time is the negotiation for the National Skills Partnership occurs during 2023. and the Universities Accord, which is all about funding for universities, also occurs during 2023. If we cannot use this time to think about how do we incentivize the integration right across our education spectrum in terms of where funding falls, then we will have missed an opportunity that will not present itself again. And when we think about some of the way in which Jack presented his case, it doesn't have a place. It is time to really think about where those incentives for funding occur. From a TAFE perspective, we absolutely believe that our current system has absolutely swung too far into being driven by industry, and the voice of industry, although absolutely critical, because it is about jobs that create opportunities that also give people equitable outcomes in life as they acquire the skills that give them the income they need to be able to participate in life. The driver for the whole of the VET system has swung too far away from a conversation about what is the role of education. And it's the role of education in creating those transferable skills and the role of the educator in creating those transferable skills that has been diminished during the last 10 to 15 years. And it is time now to rethink that what that balance should be. We have been part of a system that has reformed. I've been around for 30 years in TAFE, and I think the word reform has been in every year I've been here. You can't just keep reforming. There is a moment in time when you have to make a decision around what sort of policy and what sort of vocational education and training system we want going forward. And we certainly have some fears out of TAFE that some of that reform that we're going to witness during 2023 will be insufficient to bring about the level of change that is part of this conversation today in terms of equity, opportunity, and inclusion. So I think some of the critical things that need to be considered are, firstly, there are a lot of actors in this vocational education and training system, right across its whole dimension. There's a lot to be gained, I think, at a bureaucratic level by keeping all of those actors involved. However, what it can do is fragment where the educator has power and where the educator is able to impact and influence. We do need to think about whether the perpetuation of a marketized system for vocational education and training is in fact creating a cost as opposed to really putting the funding where it needs to be into where we want education to occur. We have to, as a society, ask ourselves some of those questions. Did what happened through this very highly marketized system produce the outcomes that we were looking for? And I guess it's not only VET that needs a conversation about that, it's also some of our healthcare priorities where we saw the for-profit motive come through our aged care sector. Have we in fact, through that approach in these very fundamental social justice policy dimensions, delivered what was envisaged by those changes, or have they in fact perpetuated through the ongoingness of them their own story, if you like? For us in TAFE, we need the ability to work locally with employers, so employers step more into the solutions, which might be training product solutions, rather than the controlled, which Craig referred to in his presentation earlier on, the very controlled, limited industry approach that we have to training products that we believe very strongly are limiting innovation and limiting the ability for partnerships.
3 minutes.
I'm actually happy to pull this together now in terms of our position. So just to summarize what we think are some of the important changes. We sit at a time where we have got the partnership agreement and the accord about to be negotiated. We'll never have this again. We need to maximize that opportunity to see how do we pull that incentivization together. We are about thinking about what is the role of the educator. That needs to become more strongly brought to the fore And while it is absolutely critical to creating equity that people have the skills to acquire jobs and have the skills to make good lives, that occurs through education and transferable skills, not just industry pointing to some training products that they believe are the only outcomes. And we need to look at what is the place for organisations such as JACS to have sustainable ongoing futures. And there are many of those conversations occurring in this forum today. I'm happy to call it to finish there and put some of those major policy perspectives on the table. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jenny. You made me rush to the podium and thanks being very clear. Those 3 clear points. There's a question for Jack that you hopefully will be able also to answer in the chat box that looks at how we can help you in terms of creating that change that you're looking for. And I think I should mention that I'm sure we will see some change with this kind of conversations. It might not be the big change we're all looking for, but I still think we need to be able to continue to celebrate the little things. I know you've been waiting very long for that, but the conversations are happening, but I think as you said, it's not just a campaign approach to education, it's the campaign approach to the policy change. And so I'd like now to welcome 2 of these people who are with us in this space. And Sally.
Thanks, Robbie. Thanks, everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and acknowledge that this land was never ceded and that those of us who are not the Wurundjeri people have unfinished business with the Wurundjeri people and the people of the Kulin Nation. I'd also like to pay my respects to other Aboriginal people that might be here today. I'm here to give the perspective from a gender perspective, representing women in adult and vocational education. So I speak on behalf of the untapped resource that is women. And as Robbie acknowledged earlier, and I think it was somebody actually said it at the Jobs and Skills Summit, women are in fact overtapped. They're not undertapped, they're an overtapped resource. They're underpaid and their role is not respected and not visible, but they're not in fact undertapped, they're in fact overtapped. It's very easy to trip over your words in forums like this that have a bit of a global focus and a global audience. We talk in this forum about adult learning and education. And for those who are playing at home and who might not be in the Australian context, it's probably important for you to know that in the early 1990s in Australia, a very broad patchwork of post-compulsory education that included our public TAFE colleges, workers' education associations, adult and community education, mechanics institutes, were all subsumed under the banner of VET. Public libraries were about the only post-compulsory education system that were left outside. They were the only ones left outside that banner of VET. And when we're talking about gender equity in VET, one of the problems we have is, as Elaine alluded earlier, the foundations and underlining assumptions of VET are based on norms, systems and structures based on the first and second industrial age. So they are not in line with Industry 5.0, which is human-centric, sustainable, and focused on preserving resources and creating social stability. So that's the fundamental issue we have. And I'm really aware of the irony of having this conversation in RMIT, because also for those of you who are playing at home and might not know, RMIT started its life as working men's institution, and its original aim was a skilled hand and a cultivated mind, and it was a men's college. And at the time, they made a twin to it, which was for women, and that would be the Emily McPherson School for Cooking. So if you go down the road here, you'll find what was the I think the sign's still there, School for Cooking. So the gendered origins of VET are baked into the system. They are in fact in the walls that surround us, and that's the fundamental issue that we have when we talk about gender equity. And so as a result, at WAVE, we've started to become quite bolshy lately. We are drawing on the spirit of Audre Lorde, who quite famously said that the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house. We think there's a bit of time for dismantling of the system as we know it. And so in our submissions recently, we've had a real eye out for old wine in new bottles. We're really very concerned about the capacity of the system to meet some of the aspirations that Craig and others talked about earlier, when it has that foundation that is so thoroughly gendered and also based on colonial concepts and other deeply concerning worldviews. So it was terrific. I have to acknowledge how exciting it was to hear the Minister at the beginning talk about gender equity and to put it so front and centre. Very exciting to see a pillar of the Victorian Skills Plan focused on gender equity, gender impact assessments and assessments, all these things that we've been calling for years. It's so exciting. But I guess our challenge at WAVE for the policymakers in the room is to do what my PhD supervisor says to me all the time, which is to think harder. We want policymakers to think harder, and we want them to really think about the origins of VET, and we want them to particularly think about the particular citizen, worker, consumer that underpins our conceptions of VET, because we don't recognise that citizen, worker, consumer. So Jack talked earlier about the Literacy for Life Foundation and Aboriginal people more generally being in a policy vacuum. We think there's a lot of groups in that policy vacuum because we think the system has been based on a conception that doesn't work for many of us at all, quite frankly. So that's our challenge. It is really, we'd like to see an intersectional feminist view of the conception of the citizen, worker, consumer that underpins the entire VET system. And I know that sounds very, very challenging, but I think until we do so, we'll continue to have, you know, rather too much of our population really constantly having conversations about how we can tweak the system to meet the needs of the very people that need the system the most. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I can't even jump up. Okay, thank you very much, Sally. I see Craig is trying to do a re-acknowledge and just say. Thank you very much, Craig. It's catching my breath, Sally. Thank you very much for that. And so I'd like to ask now the other Jenny in the room, to be able to then share from the Adult Learning Australia perspective. Thanks, Jenny.
Thank you, Robbie, and thank you to all the speakers that we've had so far, particularly to Elaine for all the work that you and your other author area have put into the Fair Go for All report, and I think really that stands on its own on the title about what we're really talking about here. I want to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation here too, and like Elaine, I often refer this part to the original lifelong learners and educators, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of this country, and we've got a lot to learn from their wisdom and their knowledge. And Adult Learning Australia has supported formally the Uluru Statement of the Heart, so I'm really proud to work for an organisation that's done that. I think we really need, and we've heard so much today, and I was really pleased that Elaine, you captured a lot of things that I had in my notes, particularly in terms of the sort of transition that we're going through, and concur with Elaine about the fact that we really need to take a bold approach. The world is facing a whole range of risks, and as Elaine pointed out, the Global Risk Report, there is a new one that's just come out for 2023 from the World Economic Forum, and I do encourage you to have a look and see what it says. It talks about polycrises, which I think Robbie or Bruce mentioned earlier on at the beginning of the forum. So looking at cost of living, climate change, catastrophic weather events, social unrest, war, trade wars, all happening multiple times over and over and over. So this is something that we haven't really faced in our lifetimes before, but it also does have some solutions in there. So how do we respond? What do we need to do, and what tools do we need to ensure we can make the best of this transition? And what I call is build and create a new story for humanity at this time that's fair and just, so we can build this new future. Now, UNESCO Global Report on ALE, Adult Learning and Education, which was released last year, tells us that the ultimate 21st century skill is the ability to learn. So I think that foremost there, they've identified what we really need to have as a priority. We know that our systems that we've been using are fragile, they're no longer relevant, democracy is at risk, and democracy only works when people have both access to rights and also understand their responsibilities, both in society and civic role, and they can make informed decisions for themselves and their communities. So we need better research, and it's great to see research coming up like Elaine's and also other research that's happening in the sector. PIAC, which the OECD Commission's PIAC, the last one we had for Australia was around 2010-11. It's over 10 years ago, and unfortunately we're not going ahead with PIAC with the OECD this time. COVID held it back and there's been some issues, so the Minister has announced that Jobs and Skills Australia research component will look at how they continue that kind of research, and they're engaging with the Australian Bureau of Statistics and others to look at how they might undertake some kind of research to look at the levels of adult literacy and numeracy and digital skills in Australia. But we do need longitudinal studies in different settings, looking at both remote and rural, and as Jack talked about, there's a lot of differences across different parts of Australia, whether it's urban, regional, rural or remote. And we also need a proper assessment of the capabilities and the capacity of the adult education, the adult educator workforce, particularly around literacy and numeracy, and educators to understand their needs and what needs to be done, because there's a lot of transition happening there. We've got adult educators who are retiring. There's not necessarily the replacement that we need. We need to look at it in terms of short and long term. We also need to have, and have people have also talked about today, the right policy and planning settings. I think we need to be ambitious. I mean, we really need to be looking at longer term plans as well as short term steps. So why aren't we looking at 20 and 30 year plans about how we envisage our country should be, and how education and learning and vocational education can help us get there? So we need, and we need it based on access and equity. We need targets and timelines. So when we hear that there's 1 in 5 working aged adults who struggle with reading and writing, according to the last PX study, we need to be looking at how we can totally change that so that the majority of adults have access to reading, writing skills they need to live a meaningful life and have opportunities at work. We need to be inclusive in our policy and planning settings. We need to recognise formal, non-formal and informal learning. And as Literacy for Life has shown, particularly for those that are often marginalised, formal qualification isn't the entry point. Usually opportunities that are non-formal or informal in safe settings are the first foot in the door where you can build people's confidence and provide the support that they need. We also need resources, leadership and partnerships. So I am pleased to see that this government is focusing on different aspects of vocational education and training, although I think it's very challenging that we've got the portfolios of education separate from vocational education skills and training. So I'd like to see that there's a closer relationship between those portfolios and encourage working together across those and having those conversations so that we have a whole of government integrated, resourced approach, particularly to lifelong learning policy, and one that embraces different ways of learning.
3 minutes, Jenny.
Yes, thank you. I think that we also need to invest in the role of the community, adult and community education. And it's good to see that the Minister in his address today acknowledged the adult and community education sector and the role of ACE and the way it also can play a role in vocational education and pathway learning. But we need resources and we also need upskilling, particularly for the workforce there so that they have pathways. I just wanted to give an example. We've got a foundation called Learning Changes Lives Foundation, and we've provided a small amount of funding to a community setting in a public housing estate in South Australia. And they used a barista program to engage with people who had trauma in their lives, domestic violence, who'd never had work before. And this program had 40 people, 40 young people and adults through it. And at the end of that program, where they learned some business skills, they learned customer service, how to make good coffee, they learned how literacy on the run, in a sense, numeracy, went on to get jobs in the RSL, to go to further education, to become volunteers, and to build their confidence to see that there were pathways forward in the future. So some of those informal settings can really assist. So we know that our system is leaving people behind and actively excluding people from work and community. So I just want to bring you back to the UNESCO Global Report that the ultimate skill of the 21st century is to learn. The hope and possibility is in the learning, in the learner-centred, inclusive, flexible, diverse learning that we can offer. Adult education, including adult and community education, is an investment in the future. So if you want to ensure that we are inclusive and equitable for all stages of life, then we need a strong focus on lifelong learning to improve our level of employment, education and training and enhance our social and civic life. So we must really prioritise, particularly to lift the level of literacy and numeracy of adults and aim to enable all adults to have these basic literacy and numeracy skills so that together we can write a new story for our future.
I love ending with stories, but in a way, I don't want to end there. For those who are monitoring the chat, there's been some interesting conversations that have been opened up and resolved in terms of there are 3 P's that were being put up: profit, policy, and partnership. There were 3 E's that were floating in the chat box as well around elements, engagement, and enablers. And I just want to, and again, part of that conversation was to allow the speakers to hear each other, for you to hear the speakers, but also, are there any quick questions in the room before I'm going to give each of the speakers a minute or so just to say, okay, if there's something that you take out from hearing each other, what is it? What story are you taking away today, or what is it that you'd like to be able to do? So, but if there's any question in the room, I've asked for next. We've already extended. We might extend the lunch and the start of the breakout. I just don't want to lose this particular space where that conversation has started. And again, I want to say it's not going to end here. So, if there are no urgent, it's that question before lunch already. So. Is that the feeling? Are we lost the alive, alert, awake, enthusiastic people in the room? No, they're still here. Yes. Okay. So if not, I'd like to start, I guess, Jack, I'd like to begin with you to be able, if you could just a few words, and again, that you'd like to leave us with, or challenges, I guess, that you'd like to leave us with in terms of hopefully that what can we see in our lifetimes? Jack?
Yeah, look, I think just really quickly, I think the foundation does need an opportunity to scale up. We know it works. It's been, independently evaluated. The students have been independently assessed now, using this, the Australian Core Skills Framework for over 10 years, and we're graduating people, as I said, in the same space 4 times higher than anywhere else. There's no more important beginning than reading and writing. And to be honest with you, I just think for me the bottom line is for our children is that they have literate mums. That's the critical component in all of this for us. So if people want to take anything away, or two things away, one is to work with us to try to get these communities funded to scale it up on a national level. But take away the fact that without literate mothers, we will never have fully functional literate communities. That's the bottom line.
Thank you very much, Jack. Jenny, Dodd, you resolved the debates in the room. Thank you in the chat box.
Thank you. Look, my final comment is use the right professionals to do the right job. And that should be the philosophy that drives us. And that's that point around making sure that the right educators, whether they come from the community education sector, as Jenny McCaffer so rightly presented, or whether they are educators within TAFE, we need those partnerships, whether they are from Jack's organisation, we need those partnerships that allow the right professionals to achieve the right outcomes. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. Sally? Yep.
Look, my big takeaway, I think, is that we've got a really unique opportunity, and I was really struck by the consistent message across the day from people representing different viewpoints, that the system is really not working for so many people that it really needs a rethink, a root and branch rethink.
Thanks, Sally. Jenny?
Well, I concur with everyone, but I think getting people to care about this issue outside of our sector is really important. I spent last Thursday night working with people that are homeless on the streets down the road and talking with them about reading and writing. And I just think we need to, and it's a real barrier in their lives. So I think we just need to promote and value how important it is and encourage people to care about this issue beyond us. Thank you.
And Elaine, you're writing a new report? No, we have to get this report out first.
Yes, I very much concur. Like the other speakers have said, I think we have a common vision. We've just now got to work out how, as in our own individual ways, we're all going to kind of push to get beyond short-termism, to reclaim education and training in an inclusive, integrated way as a public good. So we've got easy access to affordable, relevant, future-oriented learning that supports work and life, that we don't get too much in one position or the other. And yes, absolutely, let's use this moment to transform. And all the time I've been involved, the last time I felt that we had this opportunity was when ANTA was established. It's been pretty much downhill since then, but now I think we've got a moment to seize the moment, carpe diem, and let's keep sharing so we can see some real change.
And so let's stay alive, alert, awake, and enthusiastic.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. Can we give our panel and the people online a round of applause? Okay. Bruce, before we close, I just want to give some announcements for the next bit. So we're for the people in the online, there's going to be a half-hour break. And then we have a little snack for those in here outside. For those who haven't registered for the breakouts, as I said, the breakout conversations, we will have a conversation with 1 or 2 people. And again, if I could just have the first thing I announce is we have an interim statement that we, the organizers, would like to share with you. I think is that the next slide, Eden? Just so that you all have copies of the policy statement. I'm not going to read the policy statement, but the statement basically just calls for 3 things: to enact national lifelong learning policy, support and sustain an equitable adult and vocational education system, and meet our international commitments to quality education and lifelong learning. You all have it in print. For those online, you have the link. Kat is providing the link. You can pick it from the Adult Learning Australia website, or we can also upload it there. So if there's anybody who's interested, organizations are interested, we're hoping to release this and then be able to draw on who else is interested in supporting the policy statement, unless there are violent reactions. But it's been through a series of discussions. This has been drawn from the submissions that ACED, ALA, WAVE, and RMIT have done through from the beginning of the process of ConfinTIA last June to the test summit and the outcomes, as Jenny said, in terms of the national, I think this Elaine, the national statement. So we're in that policy space. For those who are joining us, so if we just go, sorry, Eden. So those are the three things in the statement: lifelong learning policy. The next one is the equitable adult learning, vocation, education, and commitments. For those who are joining us for the breakouts, we're not doing a hybrid breakout because it's just going to be too difficult. So there are 3 breakout rooms in this building. For those who are interested in I'm just going to get my little, here in this room, we will have Sally leading in the gender equality. So if you're interested in transforming education through gender equality challenges hosted by WAVE, please come back to this room. Bruce will be leading one on, and part of the discussion, and we put climate change in, is this whole idea of what kind of economy are we preparing our learners for. And so if you're interested in exploring the idea of what kind of learning is needed for climate change, Bruce will be in courtroom 3, and you will need to look for Bruce because there's a swipe thing that you have to go through. And courtroom 3 is actually just, you need to go down, back down, and up the next building. The numbers in the buildings at RMIT don't make sense. This is building 1, the next is building 20. So somewhere we lost 2 to 19. Okay, they're somewhere there, but it's that like the TARDIS. You go in and you're somewhere else. Okay, and Jenny, for those interested in looking at adult learning, lifelong learning, and the workplace. Okay, again, it's just down in the large boardroom. Okay? So the large boardroom is just down here towards that area. No, just down here. Sorry, towards the street, right? Yep. Okay, so those are the 3. We'll keep that up. For those who are joining us online, you will see me in half an hour online in some virtual room. We will appear. There's a separate link. This link is for the plenary. We will come back here at 2 o'clock, right? At 2 o'clock for the plenary, where you will hear the report backs from the different breakouts. Okay, and then we will formally close the day. But we're formally closing the morning session, and I'd like to invite Bruce to do the honors for the morning session. I haven't forgotten anything. Somebody remind me. Maren, is there some? I haven't. Good. Okay. Okay.
It's always scary to be that person standing between a group of people and lunch, isn't it? and especially when you're 10 minutes overdue. So let me be very brief. First thing to say is to add my thanks to the presenters this morning. I think they've done a terrific job in presenting pretty sharply the challenge that we face. And when we call an event something like Transforming Education, then you now know why we've used that language. I think Elaine put it very succinctly. Our current institutional frameworks, our presumptions, our pedagogies are not fit for purpose. And the requirement for much greater agility, for much greater understanding about what counts as knowledge and how knowledge is useful, they're different kinds of challenges than they've been previously. And we all will play a part in helping to sort out what the new and effective ways of doing these things are. So thanks very much indeed to these people, but thanks also to you for your engagement so far. And the conversations after lunch will give us a bit of a chance to start to explore what some of those alternative processes might look like. Thank you very much indeed.
Can I just say, on behalf of the people here. Thank you to those that organised this, the administration, the logistics. It's all worked really well, and it's really complex with so many people in person and the online people. I think we've all felt included and equitable, and that's down to the administration. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carolyn. So yeah, we're still ahead of time, so we'll see you at 1 o'clock. 1 o'clock for those, again, in the rooms, and then 1 o'clock for the online people. Thanks, Jack. Thanks, Jenny, online. And we'll see, for some of you, we'll see you at 2 o'clock for the coming back together.
My privilege to be here today is because I'm associated with a great organisation called WAVE, and over the past few months have been getting to know the incredible people that support, nurture and lead this work in ALA, at RMIT, and I know I've missed so many names there that I feel embarrassed. My job today is to help try to pull some of the comments and ideas that have emerged in conversation this afternoon. And as I'm doing that, I'm reflecting on that we're on Wurundjeri land. I want to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And it's in the spirit of that I guess I want to have that conversation about being in reconciliation with our Aboriginal friends and leaders. They were the first teachers, they were the first educators, yeah, I commit to the voice as a practical and respectful invitation from the Uluru Statement from the Heart. I wondered if a really good way of doing this would be to invite the facilitators who led the discussion to speak to what emerged from them. And then after this, I hope that from that we can get a sense of, well, what are the key emerging themes as we seek to identify at this moment, what are the challenges and the opportunities for transforming training and education? How does that sound like a plan? No? Okay. Because I know her best in this room, who's been a facilitator, and I'm going to ask the wonderful Sally Thompson just to reflect what emerged from her conversation, which was glorious. Thank you.
Thanks, Kit. Yeah, we were quite an intimate little group, which was lovely. So we dispensed with all technology and had a really lovely conversation. And we were also quite a diverse group too. I had some wonderful colleagues from the primary sector, as well as people working in adult education and law and engineering and all sorts of interesting things. So we had a fairly far-reaching conversation really around that perennial question of structures and individual agency. So what were the structures that were enabling gender equality, and what were the structures that were constraining gender equality? But also, very helpful in the question guide, reflecting at the end about some of the areas where we do have agency in our individual schools and workplaces, within our community groups, within policy forums like this one, and some of the things that we can do to enable gender equality within our group. And in terms of and we talked a lot about that particular question in a range of different training and learning environments. So from schools right through to, we've solved all of the challenges in the construction industry, getting women into construction, where we've also solved disability services. There's a few other industries which we ran out of time to deal with, but that's where we got to.
Yeah, so I think what I noticed, because I was lucky enough to be part of that conversation, is the informal and the formal. The adapting to create networks to support the gender equality work, the recognition that gender equality is not just a woman's problem, that gender equality is for all genders, and the intersecting barriers that play a part of that. And what I noticed again is just the role of conversation. I think we modelled that in that thing, just the sharing and the use of the personal story to reflect the change that needs to occur. Yeah, thank you so much. Robbie, did you solve the world's problems in your session?
Yes, I did. Yeah. And so,
yes.
And I start by actually asking Ash to share with us.
No worries.
That's how I saw.
Thank you.
Ash.
Thank you. So our session focused on the question, how can we achieve inclusive, equitable and sustainable education and vocational education sector as part of a lifelong learning system in Australia? And we focused first on challenges. Some of the challenges raised by our group were that the focus should not just be on delivery of education, but actually on assessment as well, and how assessment can better reflect learning rather than other needs of industry or compliance that might get in the way sometimes. So making sure that metrics and assessment reflect the learning, that's our actual aim. There was some talk about the challenges for digital literacy and these kinds of lifelong learning skills, which are just emerging and need to be made prominent. Ideas about stopping segregation between lifelong learning, private, public sectors, registered and non-registered, so breaking down some of the barriers. We had a lot of talk about a lack of transparency as a challenge and the need for clearer measures about what is happening and then what are the goals of lifelong learning and adult education. We also talked about the importance of literacy and foundational skills in school to lead into lifelong learning and set people up with foundations for diverse ways of learning that are maybe not already supported and that can disadvantage people as they move through the life course from accessing further education or accessing the workplace. There was talk about curriculum structures and policy being a one-size-fits-all still in many instances, and the need to build the capabilities and devote resources to the vet sector for literacy and basic foundational skills. I believe that's all for challenges, but Robbie will fill in any blanks, I'm sure. Then we moved on to talking about the lessons that arose through existing policy and practice, and there was an emphasis on action and the need to act, that we have quite a lot of research, quite a lot of policy, and that there are hundreds of documents, and now is the time to make some moves. That reform should be in the correct direction, that we need to think really carefully about how reform is enacted and what the goals are, not just towards industry, but towards learning in its own right. To reassess whose needs we aim to satisfy when reforming systems, and not just have reform that mirrors policy without consulting with community and having a grassroots focus. Discussion around the policy and practice that has been community-led being the most successful, and looking at what learning is successful rather than looking at compliance or other types of reform. So again, bringing focus back to learning. There was also a focus on diverse delivery and making blended delivery and different types of learning accessible for people who are maybe disadvantaged. So particularly with low literacy learners, especially adults, being unable to access formal courses during the day and things like that. So I'll pass over to Robbie for the last section. Thank you.
Yeah, and we ended up, so this was the online breakout group. We had, I think, 7 participants there. So I'd like to acknowledge the people who are online who joined us. And I think part of that, we ended up with a question, what steps can we as individuals do? And I think just we wanted to end up with a positive note around this notion that, you know, again, focus on successful learning. Like there was a recognition that this is a special moment in time, the opportunity to be able to make change. And so yet we can be critical, but still be able to look at how can we, therefore, the fact that there's a greater consciousness of the problem and being able to identify, but also then be able then to still have conversations despite there were some like earlier, the disagreement about the role of the private sector, the market and all that. But at the same time, again, as Ash also mentioned, how do you put community more central to that conversation? Okay, and I think one of the key things that came out, and I think was this notion that we need more time as educators, as policymakers, also to be able to reflect on our expertise, our experience, but then act on that. Not just so more structured time to be able to reflect. And they were saying that just more conversations like we're having today that begin to challenge some assumptions around, for example, stereotyping of the learners, for example, in terms of needs, but also how do we empower the learners to be able to understand the system that they have to navigate. Okay, there was some talk about like the market demanded short stackable skills very quick. But I think part of that, and I think there was some conversation about, and maybe it was Ellen, how can we get the learners to first identify their need and then take them through, okay, so this is what you want, this is what's available, and so they have a more realistic understanding. So part of that is, in other words, I think part of that is helping the learner to learn also about the system. Particularly that it's not just about schooling, which it's easy. Okay, I graduated and all that, but now we're navigating a different kind of system. So if the learner then, part of that is to empower the learner to be able to say, so if I want this, this is where I can go, and this is what I have. Because I think one of the things they mentioned is some of the learners don't want themselves to be labeled, I don't want to be labeled as, I don't have basic literacy. And so that's their choice, but it should not stop them from being able to access those skills in the way that they want. So I think it's part of that flexibility, but part of that contextualization, but also part of giving the learner, again, the capacity to be able to navigate the system. Did I answer the problems of the world?
Yeah, I think you did. It's interesting. I'm struck by your feedback. One of the challenges in my job is the navigation of the health system. Yeah, and some of the things that you're saying completely resonated with the challenges that all people really, have with navigating complex systems. I think that's really interesting. And I was struck by what you said. I literally came from a webinar as I was packing up on the rechange to the training package and qualification systems. You talked about some of the challenges being about literacy and foundation and the segregation of the pathways. And, you know, they're trying to, with this tool called a training package, fix some of these things up. So I think you're right. It is the moment, isn't it? It is the moment. We had climate change, didn't we, as well? You did that, did you? Did you fix climate change? Okay. Did you? Please.
We had the privilege of having in the room a good core of people who are grappling directly with the issues about workplace experience of climate change and ways of engaging people's skill development so as to be able to be leading a process of adaptation to climate change rather than being smothered by it. Todd in particular, if I can single Todd out, has done some research on that. And one of I think the things that we were all interested in was that the research that he reported on has drawn out some of the implications of climate change for all workers. We're not just talking about gardeners who are outside when it's 40 degrees. All of us in one way or another are going to be affected directly by a hot climate. What to do about it? Well, there is work going on about it. I mean, there's the kind of that effort to try and understand in the first place, to actually recognise what the parameters of the issue are, and perhaps within that where the opportunities for engagement are. Where do you start to move things around? And clearly, people like Nicole, who I'll single out again as somebody who's representing a failing system. Sorry, Nicole. Sorry. I think really what the conversation drew out, and I've had a bit of fun with Nicole, so I apologise. But how does a system which is based on looking backwards suddenly start looking forwards? We're all in that situation. We all derive our knowledge, we all derive our capability from things that have gone previously. And yet we're confronted by a set of circumstances which are unknowable. We do not know what the world's going to be like. And yet we're trying to prepare kids, we're trying to prepare adults, we're trying to prepare current workers for engaging with this unknowable future. That's the kind of challenge that we're asking our vet colleagues, our higher ed colleagues, our school colleagues all to engage with. One of the reasons why I'm increasingly not enthusiastic, Robbie, where have you gone? I'm pessimistic about our formal institutions, and increasingly believe that the opportunity for dealing with this unknowable future is going to come from the informal elements of learning and engagement. It's going to come from the kinds of conversations which occur, again, to go back to Todd, in union, occupational health and safety rooms. It's going to come from the kind of conversations that occur at play school as parents kind of disperse and then go home after play school. That's where there's going to be learning about how we might best engage with the kinds of challenges that we currently face. And we're not up to it. That is the simple reality. And so, to go back to the comments I made right at the start of the day, we do actually have a new spirit of enthusiasm with a new federal government. The minister's speech this morning was about trying to create something anew. We've got a very new Victorian Skills Authority. 18 months is nothing, isn't it? It's nothing. But we've got an opportunity now to start to think a bit more creatively about how those formal institutions can start to move from being laggards to actually recognising that what they're trying to deal with is unknowable, and what does that then mean for what you do now? And that is our challenge. What are we going to do now about engaging with this unknowable future? That's what climate crisis means. And we're poorly served by public forums that want to politicise these issues in the interests of private capital, personal interest, rather than recognising that really, until we start to put some of these things out there, engage with them in an open and discursive way, we're never going to get any chance of knowing what the unknowable future might be. Now, those of you who are in the room with me might think that I've been at a completely different place than you. So if so, please say so.
I think I'm hearing these themes of it's a people business. And did I detect there, Bruce, a sort of, the observation that the system is defining skill needs in retrospective way, but actually the future of climate change is unknown. So it requires a more gestalt way of understanding and developing the future. Excellent. So with that, I would like to, for a moment, if I can, just open it up to the floor. Is there anything in the discussion? Yeah. Jenny, would you like to say? Oh, there's one more. I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. I was looking 6 different places on the seat. Please, I'd love to. Would you like to come out, or are you happy to stay there? Thank you.
I've forgotten again, adult educators. Well, we had a small group, a very small, intimate group of 3 of us who really care about adult educators. So this is what we came up with, and it was very productive, so thank you. One of the things that we talked about was the need for professional development to make it easy, accessible and affordable. And often there isn't enough time given for adult educators to network, attend conferences, and participate, whether it's online or in person today, because there's no ability to either pay for that, to backfill, to do all of those things. But we think that's very important to keep people connected and up to date. We also went into a discussion about various micro-credentials and what might be available. We looked at the shortage in vocational education in terms of teachers and educators there, and again, backfilling was another issue, and teaching different levels and the sorts of processes that are used. The currency of qualifications was something you've got to keep up to date at the same time as delivering a whole range of courses and teaching, and then that can have impact on health and wellbeing given the high workloads and some of the challenges that we've had, particularly during COVID, when adult educators were expected to be learning at the same time, delivering and still maintaining the systems and services. We talked about the need for peer support and how important those networks are to look at what's working and with other educators, and just to have a sounding board for some people who really need that opportunity, whether they're new and coming in or whether they've been around for a while. That's access to specialist expertise. So it was noted in this, in our breakout session, but I also know that this is fairly common, that there's a high percentage of learners coming in to adult education who might have greater needs around literacy and numeracy, so not only expected to respond to all the other demands, but you might have an increase, 5 or 10% increase in vulnerable learners or students who might have difficulty with literacy and numeracy. So what do you do then? Who can you call on to help and assist address some of those learner issues and to support you? Looking at how to impact on the policymakers and making sure that there's those interactions, but the importance of recognising the critical role of committed adult educators and how much keeping adult educators together and keeping you going and the sector going is so important. And we saw a good example obviously through COVID, but I think there's a lot of weariness around in terms of having to respond to so many things without the recognition, without the opportunities for a break, without the opportunities to pursue career pathways because they're so limited by time, access and money. So I think it's really important that we congratulate adult educators who keep us going and are going to take us through the future, even for you, Bruce. Thank you.
Thank you. So I think one of the things I've learned about adult educators, and I keep hearing this theme, is the just how tight the margins are. And what I mean by the margins is the time. If there's a 5% increase in literacy needs, where does that come from? The time and resource to develop yourself. We had an example of people just creating the peer networks in our discussion, didn't we? The value of the peer and this constant theme that it's a people business and how they need to be looked after and nurtured. So I'm not sure if anyone would like to make any comments or if there's anything that came out from your group that you think is really important to put forward. And online, of course. Thank you. Oh. Yeah. Paul's still there. Yeah, Paul's still there. Focus on successful post-school learning and work to redesign or adjust our current systems to be able to provide this for throughout their lives. There's this constant journey of this lifelong learning piece. I know that, Elaine, you talk about equity being the great, problem that is yet to be solved, but it seems to me that there's a parallel there with lifelong learning. It's almost like the solution to the equity problem, almost, in some of the way it works, isn't it? Do you think? Which is integrated in our sectors.
Yes, they run side by side. Yeah. That for the system to be equitable and inclusive, all of the sectors of education, the 4 sector systems need to be integrated under some formalised lifelong learning system where pathways become easy and people can navigate the whole learning environment, the whole ecosystem much more readily. So yes, that's part of the big picture. And something I said this morning is we have our government saying that, I think the word was promoting. We need them to be doing more than promoting it. We need to be getting the structures in that link.
Systems and the structures.
Yeah.
Keeps coming up. Yes.
Thank you, Jenny and Elaine, for consolidating what we just spoke about. That brings me to another comment, Colette, but the workload model where you touched on the life balance of the whole thing. Is it a solution? Do we have a formula which fits right amongst where we are in poly crisis? So whether it's climate change, whether it's, you name it, digital literacy has, is that a solution to have that a good workload calculator for what we are doing as an adult educator?
For my sins, a very, very long time ago, I used to be a corporate trainer. Do you remember that phrase? So Monday it was Toll, Tuesday it was the Commonwealth Bank, Wednesday and Thursday it might have been the local council in Blacktown. And I worked for women who had multiple degrees. And I trained everything from transport workers out on a pad in Warragul through to call centres at Centrelink, wherever, because I was told and trained that, and this is an awful term, and I am a gender equity person, so I do appreciate the irony of this, that good educators can teach cockroaches how to turn tricks. And what that means is that they have a breadth of skill. They have a breadth of skill in what they do. So if they need to move to the digital platform, they can. If they need to go to a courageous small conversation, they can. If they need to have that small coaching conversation, they can. If they need to sit and listen, they can. If they need to instructionally design a new session in the moment because that's the problem that needs to be solved, they can. So I wonder if it's not about a formula, but actually what you were talking about, Jenny, which is about the capability for affordable people to get these people resourced to go to where they are. That's true. Not everyone can be a doctor. Not everyone can be a vet. Yeah. Yep. I don't know, I think it's worth us going back to the days of, if I can say it, Cat 1 and Cat 2, right? That you learn about learning, you learn about sequencing, you learn about how people need to hear information at a certain point in time and that different people learn differently. That's my experience of good educators. And I think what I hear, and I think what we're going to probably hear when we talk to and hear what that communique might be, is just that it's not a formula, or it's not a retrospective look, or it's not a unit of competency, speaking as someone that used to write those things. It's not a person, it's a system and a structure and an alignment and a group of people working collaboratively in an industry that I really feel the call is to be well recognised that it currently is. That's what yeah. So did we fix that? Yeah? Okay. I might hand over to the wonderful Robbie to talk about the communique, but I hope that was helpful.
Can we thank you? So it's at the pointy end, and now I have time not to rush through the slides. Nope. Have I lost control? Oh, come on. I can't lose control. Oop. Yeah, you press the button. Keep pressing. Okay. So I rushed through this earlier, but I think I just want to spend a moment. We have time just to read through this and see if it captures what we'd like. We were hoping to cover for today. And so I'd like to start by saying again, I acknowledge that this comes from not just the conversations we've had the last few weeks in organizing this gathering today, but also the statements that ALA, WAVE, RMIT, ACED, and the other people who've been in that space around responding to the opportunities. And so we call it the Transforming Education and Training in Australia, Challenges and Opportunities, a Policy Forum Statement. We, the members of the Australian Coalition of Education and Development, specifically Adult Learning Australia, Women in Adult and Vocational Education, and the EU Centre for Excellence at RMIT University, who have gathered during the policy forum entitled Transforming Education and Training Systems in Australia, Challenges and Opportunities on the 15th of February 2023 at RMIT University, wish to call the attention of our policymakers, our colleagues in the field of education and lifelong learning to the following statement. We believe that Australians should have access to quality adult education and training when and where they need it. The Australian government is urged to take up the challenge of transforming education and training systems to ensure that all individuals, communities, and businesses can participate equally and achieve the outcomes necessary to enjoy a sustainable emerging future. Current government policies are no longer adequate to support the transformation of our societies in the face of global challenges and changes. Access and equity to lifelong learning are the keys to ensuring that no one is left behind. So we first call to enact a national lifelong learning policy. 1. Lifelong learning must be formalized by the Australian government as a coherent, overarching framework that embraces all education and training sectors in Australia to enhance integration and articulation of the various education and training sectors and to provide flexible access to learning pathways for all Australians. A national lifelong learning policy be enacted that highlights the needs for all Australians to learn and continue to learn throughout life to face challenges of the 21st century that recognize a life course approach and the social determinants of health. In keeping with the Uluru Statement of the Heart, actively ensure Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have opportunities to define self-determination in education and to engage in rich and fulfilling learning throughout their lives. The formal policy developed must clearly outline economic and social goals, integrate efficiency and equity, and sets out roles and responsibilities for the community, business, and all levels of government. It must emphasize the life skills required and the interconnected pathways between learning opportunities. Support and sustain an equitable adult and vocational education system. The Australian government renews the ministerial declaration on adult and community education and outlines the strategies to support adult and community education organizations as they continue to deliver opportunities to many Australians, including disadvantaged learners. The Australian government must develop, implement, and monitor nationally consistent policies and guidelines utilizing intersectional gender equity approach that embeds equity, inclusiveness, and diversity in all the sectors of education and training. Adopt policies and guidelines that create a safe and more equitable adult and vocational education system that delivers for students and learners of all abilities, communities, and industry. Gender disaggregated data is used to plan for and forecast labor and skills needs and to measure effectiveness of a student's journey and outcomes to address the inequitable nature of the vocational and adult education system and workforce. The Australian government must commit to We want them to commit. Come on. Oh, we jumped ahead. The Australian government must commit to developing and resourcing a national adult literacy strategy that targets and timelines. Develop the capacity of skills, workforce development, language literacy, and numeracy in adult education sectors and systems to be more inclusive, sustainable, productive, flexible, and aligned to our community needs and emerging economic, environmental, and social cultural challenges. Finally, meet our international commitments to quality education and lifelong learning, and that the Australian government take concrete steps to meet its international commitments to the Sustainable Development Goals, in particularly SDG 4, to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all, and to actively engage UNESCO and other member states to promote and implement the Marrakesh Framework for Action, which I introduced earlier as part of Conventia. I think I wanted to read through that because I think it echoes some of the conversations. I still think we've missed some, like the idea of climate change, but I think it captures that in the key changes that we've had. So if you or your organization is interested, then we were happy to add your logo, but please communicate with Jenny and myself. So we'd like to be able to release it. But basically, this has been signed off by the EU Centre at RMIT, WAVE, the Australian Coalition for Education and Development, and Adult Learning Australia. And so we'd like hopefully that's a way for us to not just talk about it, but also express it publicly, and that we take that position. So unless there are violent reactions, and again, we can never capture and predict the conversations, but I hope that somehow it reflects some of the main discussions we've had today. So thank you very much. I'd like to call Bruce, who opened today.
This time I'm the full stop on the program.
You were not the comma for lunch.
I think I was a full stop at lunchtime as well, so I'm the full stop. Thank you so much. Thank you for facilitating that last part, Kitty. Thanks very much indeed, colleagues, for sticking with us and joining the conversation. If I were to take a line from a conversation we've been having earlier in the week from our network, you'll see one of the sponsors of today is the network that we host here on scientific and social innovation and the Sustainable Development Goals. 2020, this network began, and in 2020, we already knew that the ambitions of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals were under threat. We were kind of, doing a little bit here and a little bit there, but overall we were lagging. 2023, we've had COVID, we have the war in Ukraine, we have worsening climate circumstances, so that you might actually say yet again, to quote myself earlier, we're stuffed. Sorry, Robbie, lost my enthusiasm. We're stuffed if we continue to think and act with the kinds of systems and processes that we've taken for granted for how many decades now? A presumption about the way in which our economy works, a presumption about the way in which we provide jobs and livelihoods unequally across a whole range of different criteria. And I'm just talking about within Melbourne, let alone Australia, let alone globally. If we think that we can keep going about doing things the way we are, we have every reason to be pessimistic. We have choices. We can say that we need to fundamentally rethink the way that our world operates. That is, in fact, not Bruce Wilson standing at a podium as your full stop to a day's conversations. It's actually what the United Nations says. The United Nations calls its 2030 agenda transforming our world. Transforming doesn't mean that we get up and just work with the same sets of assumptions, the same kinds of processes, the same kinds of models that we've taken for granted for the last 10, 20, 30 years. It means we need to rethink. Thinking's important. It means we need to reconverse, new conversations. That's an important part of the process. But what we know is that if we keep going about things the way that we have up until now, we are not going to have a future that we will want to live in ourselves, let alone pass on to children and to grandchildren. So I think the kind of calls that are made in the statement that we've just looked through, they're not idle. They're not simply about saying, we'd like things to be better here. We want things to be fundamentally different. That's the challenge. That's the challenge we all have. And I stand here as somebody who works in a university, part of our formal education system, somebody who was perhaps pretty close to the hierarchy of a formal institution. The dilemma for me is that our formal institutions are part of the problem. And so whilst I was having a bit of fun at Nicole's expense earlier, we need to be engaging in the spaces between our institutions. The conversations that we have, not just here, where we've brought together a coalition, explicitly and deliberately, it's a coalition. It's bringing together different kinds of networks to cross those boundaries and talk with each other. Now, this is a civil society coalition. It's not a quadruple helix coalition with government and business or whatever. That's another whole job. But if we can't get our act together here, we don't have much chance of getting our act together with those more complex coalitions and crossings of lines. So my encouragement to you all is to keep the conversations going. I do most of my best educative work these days, and I do think I do some, not here. I do it in a whole range of different settings outside the university. People who want to talk with me, I'm prepared to listen to them all the time, want to talk to me with what they're dealing with in their daily lives, trying to understand why we are saying coal in the Latrobe Valley is dead, trying to understand what their future is going to look like when that job that they've got there finishes. That's what the future's about. And it's those kinds of conversations that will help us mobilise more and more people to recognise that keeping going the way we are, business as usual, is not the future. The future is what this conversation here is trying to point towards. So I wish you all the very best of luck in keeping the conversation going and making it happen. Thank you.
And again, yeah, before we go, I just want to thank the people in the background. Again, Marin, who's been fighting with Eventbrite all week, all month. And thank you very, very much. Eden, really, thank you. Made it smooth. Yeah. And all again, all the facilitators. What I'd like to request now is, can we have a group? It's hard to have a group picture. If we can get those online, if you want to be part of the picture, then we'll take out the screen and put your online space. And if people can come to the front here, and we'll just have a, like the old days where we have a class picture where it's possible. You can still do social distancing if you wanted to, but if we can take out the Eden, and then for those online, I really, it's nice to have how many, 17, 20 more people in the room, and so if you want to be part of the group picture, please have your, and then if we can get our colleagues here to come in front, and so. Yes. You want to be in the picture? Yeah. Okay, please. You've lost all the names. Oh, we're still here. Thank you. So if you want to be in the photograph, thank you for switching your camera on. It's so nice to see people. Come. Up to where? So Ash, come in. Eden will take. Yay! Oh wait, Ash. Wait, Ash.
I'm too tall. I'm in.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, everyone.